Chapter 16 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Mason. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 16, The Night Attack. As the girl turned to bid them good night, she thought that she saw a shadowy form moving in the darkness beyond them, and almost simultaneously she was certain that she heard the sounds of stealthy movements in the same direction. "What was that?" she whispered. "There's something out there in the darkness." "Yes," replied Tarzan. "It's a lion, and it's been there for some time. Hadn't you noticed it before?" "Oh," cried the girl, breathing a sigh of relief. "Is it our lion?" "No," said Tarzan. "It's not our lion. It is another lion, and he's hunting." "Is he stalking us?" asked the girl. "He is," replied the ape man. Smith Oldwick fingered the grip of his pistol. Tarzan saw the involuntary movement and shook his head. "Leave that thing where it is, Lieutenant," he said. The officer laughed nervously. "I couldn't help it, you know, old man," he said. "Instinct of self-preservation and all that." "It would prove an instinct of self-destruction," said Tarzan. "There are at least 3 hunting lions out there watching us. If we had a fire or the moon were up, you would see their eyes plainly. Presently they may come after us, but the chances are that they will not. If you are very anxious that they should, fire your pistol and hit one of them." "What if they do charge?" asked the girl. "There is no means of escape?" "Why, we should have to fight them," replied Tarzan. "What chance would we 3 have against them?" asked the girl. The ape man shrugged his shoulders. "One must die sometime," he said. "To you, doubtless, it may seem terrible, such a death, but Tarzan the Apes has always expected to go out in some such way. Few of us die of old age in the jungle, nor should I care to die thus. Some day Numa will get me, or Sheeta, or a black warrior, these or some of the others. What difference does it make which it is, or whether it comes tonight, or next year, or in 10 years? After it is over, it will be all the same." The girl shuddered. "Yes," she said in a dull, hopeless voice. "After it is over, it will be all the same." Then she went into the cavern and lay down upon the sand. Smith Oldwick sat in the entrance and leaned against the cliff. Tarzan squatted on the opposite side. "May I smoke?" questioned the officer of Tarzan. "I've been hoarding a few cigarettes, and if it won't attract those bouncers out there, I would like to have one last smoke before I cash in. Will you join me?" And he proffered the ape man a cigarette. "No thanks," said Tarzan, "but it will be all right if you smoke. No wild animal is particularly fond of the fumes of tobacco, so it certainly won't entice them any closer." Smith Oldwick lighted his cigarette and sat puffing slowly upon it. He had proffered one to the girl, but she had refused, and thus they sat in silence for some time, the silence of the night ruffled occasionally by the faint crushing of padded feet upon the soft sands of the gorge's floor. It was Smith Oldwick who broke the silence. "Aren't they unusually quiet for lions?" he asked. "No," replied the ape man. "The lion that goes roaring around the jungle does not do it to attract prey. They are very quiet when they are stalking their quarry." "I wish they would roar," said the officer. "I wish they would do anything, even charge. Just knowing that they are there and occasionally seeing something like a shadow in the darkness and the faint sounds that come to us from them are getting on my nerves. But I hope," he said, "that all 3 don't charge at once." "3?" said Tarzan. "There are 7 of them out there now." "Good Lord!" exclaimed Smith Oldwick. "Couldn't we build a fire?" asked the girl, "and frighten them away?" "I don't know that it would do any good," said Tarzan, "as I have an idea that these lions are a little different from any that we are familiar with, and possibly for the same reason which at first puzzled me a little. I refer to the apparent docility in the presence of a man of the lion who was with us today. A man is out there now with those lions." "It is impossible!" exclaimed Smith Oldwick. "They would tear him to pieces." "What makes you think there is a man there?" asked the girl. Tarzan smiled and shook his head. "I am afraid you would not understand," he replied. "It is difficult for us to understand anything that is beyond our own powers." "What do you mean by that?" asked the officer. "Well," said Tarzan, "if you had been born without eyes, you could not understand sense impressions that the eyes of others transmit to their brains. And, as you have both been born without any sense of smell, I am afraid you cannot understand how I can know that there is a man there." "You mean that you scent a man?" asked the girl. Tarzan nodded affirmatively. "And in the same way you know the number of lions?" asked the man. "Yes," said Tarzan. "No two lions look alike. No two have the same scent." The young Englishman shook his head. "No," he said, "I cannot understand." "I doubt if the lions or the man are here necessarily for the purpose of harming us," said Tarzan, "because there has been nothing to prevent their doing so long before they wish to. I have a theory, but it's utterly preposterous." "What is it?" asked the girl. "I think they are here," replied Tarzan, "to prevent us from going some place that they do not wish us to go. In other words, we are under surveillance, and possibly as long as we do not go where we are not wanted, we shall not be bothered." "But how are we to know where they don't want us to go?" asked Smith Oldwick. "We can't know," replied Tarzan, "and the chances are that the very place we are seeking is a place they don't wish us to trespass on." "You mean the water?" asked the girl. "Yes," replied Tarzan. For some time they sat in silence, which was broken only by an occasional sound of movement from the outer darkness. It must have been an hour later that the ape-man rose quietly and drew his long blade from its sheath. Smith Oldwick was dozing against the rocky wall of the cavern entrance, while the girl, exhausted by the excitement and fatigue of the day, had fallen into a deep slumber. An instant after Tarzan arose, Smith Oldwick and the girl were aroused by a volley of thunderous roars and the noise of many padded feet rushing towards them. Tarzan of the Apes stood directly before the entrance of the cavern, his knife in his hand, awaiting the charge. The ape-man had not expected any such concerted action as he now realized had been taken by those watching them. He had known for some time that the other men had joined those who were with the lions earlier in the evening, and when he arose to his feet it was because he knew that the lions and the men were moving cautiously closer to him and his party. He might easily have eluded them, for he had seen that the face of the cliff rising above the mouth of the cavern might be scaled by as good a climber as himself. It might have been wiser had he tried to escape, for he knew that in the face of such odds even he was helpless, but he stood his ground, though I doubt if he could have told why. He owed nothing either of duty or friendship to the girl sleeping in the cavern, nor could he longer be of any protection to her or her companion, yet something held him there in futile self-sacrifice. The great Tarmangani had not even the satisfaction of striking a blow in self-defense. A veritable avalanche of savage beasts rolled over him and threw him heavily to the ground. In falling, his head struck the rocky surface of the cliff, stunning him. It was daylight when he regained consciousness. The first dim impression bore to his awakening mind was a confusion of savage sounds which gradually resolved themselves into the growling of lions, and then, little by little, there came back to him the recollections of what had preceded the blows that had felled him. Strong in his nostrils was the scent of Numa, the lion, and against one naked leg he could feel the coat of some animal. Slowly Tarzan opened his eyes. He was lying on his side, and as he looked down his body he saw that a great lion stood straddling him, a great lion who growled hideously at something which Tarzan could not see. With the full return of his senses, Tarzan's nose told him that the beast above him was Numa of the Wamabo pit. Thus reassured, the ape-man spoke to the lion and at the same time made a motion as though he would arise. Immediately Numa stepped from above him. As Tarzan raised his head, he saw that he still lay where he had fallen before the opening of the cliff where the girl had been sleeping, and that Numa, backed against the cliffside, was apparently defending him from two other lions who paced to and fro at a short distance from their intended victim. And then Tarzan turned his eyes into the cave and saw that the girl and Smith Oldwick were gone. His efforts had been for naught. With an angry toss of his head, the ape-man turned upon the two lions who had continued to pace back and forth a few yards from him. Numa of the lion pit turned a friendly glance in Tarzan's direction, rubbed his head against the ape-man's side, and then directed his snarling countenance towards the two hunters. "I think," said Tarzan to Numa, "that you and I together can make these beasts very unhappy." He spoke in English, which of course Numa did not understand at all, but there must have been something reassuring in the tone, for Numa whined pleadingly and moved impatiently to and fro parallel to their antagonists. "Come," said Tarzan suddenly, and grasping the lion's mane with his left hand, he moved towards the other lions, his companion pacing at his side. As the two advanced, the others drew slowly back, and finally separating, moved off to either side. Tarzan and Numa passed between them, but neither the great black-maned lion nor the man failed to keep an eye on the beast near him, so that they were not caught unawares when, as though at some preconcerted signal, the two cats charged simultaneously from opposite directions. The ape-man met the charge of his antagonist after the same fashion of fighting that he had been accustomed to employing in previous encounters with Numa and Sheeta. To have attempted to meet the full shock of a lion's charge would have been suicidal even for the giant Tarmangani. Instead, he resorted to methods of agility and cunning, for quick as are the great cats, even quicker is Tarzan of the Apes. With outspread, raking talons and bared fangs, Numa sprang for the naked chest of the ape-man. Throwing up his left arm as a boxer might ward off a blow, Tarzan struck upward beneath the left forearm of the lion, and at the same time rushing in with his shoulder beneath the animal's body and simultaneously drove his blade into the tawny hide behind the shoulder. With a roar of pain, Numa wheeled again, the personification of bestial rage. Now indeed would he exterminate this presumptuous man-thing who dared even to think that he could thwart the king of beasts in his desires. But as he wheeled, his intended quarry wheeled with him. Brown fingers locked into the heavy mane on the powerful neck, and again the blade struck deep into the lion's side. Then it was that Numa went mad with hate and pain, and at the same instant the ape-man leapt full upon his back. Easily before had Tarzan locked his legs beneath the belly of a lion while he clung to its long mane and stabbed it until his point reached its heart. So easy it had seemed before that he experienced a sharp feeling of resentment that he was unable to do so now, for the quick movements of the lion prevented him. And presently, to his dismay, as the lion leapt and threw him about, the ape-man realized that he was swinging inevitably beneath those frightful talons. With a final effort he threw himself from Numa's back and sought, by his quickness, to elude the frenzied beast for the fraction of an instant that would permit him to regain his feet and meet the animal again upon a more even footing. But this time Numa was too quick for him, and he was but partially up when a great paw struck him on the side of the head and bowled him over. As he fell, he saw a black streak shoot above him and another lion close upon his antagonist. Rolling from beneath the two battling lions, Tarzan regained his feet, though he was half dazed and staggering from the impact of the terrible blow he had received. Behind him he saw a lifeless lion lying torn and bleeding upon the sand, and before him Numa the Pit was savagely mauling the second lion. He of the black coat tremendously outclassed his adversary in point of size and strength as well as in ferocity. The battling beasts made a few feins and passes at each other before the larger succeeded in fastening his fangs in the other's throat, and then, as a cat shakes a mouse, the larger lion shook the lesser, and when his dying foe sought to roll beneath and rake his conqueror with his hind claws, the other met him halfway at his own game, and as his great talons buried themselves in the lower part of the other's chest and then were raked downward with all the terrific strength of the mighty hind legs, the battle was ended. As Numa rose from his second victim and shook himself, Tarzan could not but again note the wondrous proportions and symmetry of the beast. The lions they had bested were splendid specimens themselves, and in their coats Tarzan noted a suggestion of the black which was such a strongly marked characteristic of Numa the Pit. But their manes were just a trifle darker than an ordinary black-maned lion, but the tawny shade of the balance of their coats predominated. However, the ape-man realized that they were a distant species from any he had seen, as though they had sprung originally from a cross between the forest lion of his acquaintance and a breed of which Numa the Pit might be typical. The immediate obstruction in his way having been removed, Tarzan was for setting out in search of the spoor of the girl and Smith Oldwick that he might discover their fate. He suddenly found himself tremendously hungry, and as he circled about over the sandy bottom searching among the tangled network of innumerable tracks for those of his protégés, there broke from his lips involuntarily the whine of a hungry beast. Immediately Numa the Pit pricked up his ears, and, regarding the ape-man steadily for a moment, he answered the call of hunger and started briskly off towards the south, stopping occasionally to see if Tarzan was following. The ape-man realized that the beast was leading him to food, and so he followed, and as he followed, his keen eyes and sensitive nostrils sought for some indication of the direction taken by the man and the girl. Presently, out of the mass of lion tracks, Tarzan picked up those of many sandaled feet and the scent spoor of the members of the strange race such as had been with the lions the night before, and then faintly he caught the scent spoor of the girl and a little later that of Smith Oldwick. Presently the tracks thinned, and here those of the girl and the Englishman became well marked. They had been walking side by side, and there had been men and lions to the right and left of them, and men and lions in front and behind. The ape-man was puzzled by the possibilities suggested by the tracks, but in the light of any previous experience he could not explain satisfactorily to himself what his perceptions indicated. There was little change in the formation of the gorge. It still wound its erratic course between precipitous cliffs. In places it widened out, and again it would become very narrow, and always deeper the further south they traveled. Presently the bottom of the gorge began to slope more rapidly. Here and there were indications of ancient rapids and waterfalls. The trail became more difficult, but was well marked and showed indications of great antiquity, and in places the handiwork of man. They proceeded for a half or 3/4 of a mile when, at a turning of the gorge, Tarzan saw before him a narrow valley cut deep into the living rock of the earth's crust, with the lofty mountain ranges bounding it upon the south. How far it extended east and west he could not see, but apparently it was no more than 3 or 4 miles across from north to south. That it was a well-watered valley was indicated by the wealth of vegetation that carpeted its floor from the rocky cliffs upon the north to the mountains on the south. Over the edge of the cliffs from which the ape-man viewed the valley, a trail had been hewn that led downward to the base. Preceded by the lion, Tarzan descended into the valley, which, at this point, was forested with large trees. Before him the trail wound onward toward the center of the valley. Raucous-voiced birds of brilliant plumage screamed among the branches, while innumerable monkeys chattered and scolded above him. The forest teemed with life, and yet there was borne in upon the ape-man a sense of unutterable loneliness, a sensation that he had never before had felt in his beloved jungles. There was an unreality in everything about him, in the valley itself, lying hidden and forgotten in what was supposed to be an arid waste. The birds and the monkeys, while similar in type to many with which he was familiar, were identical with none, nor was the vegetation without its idiosyncrasies. It was as though he had been suddenly transported to another world, and he felt a strange restlessness that might easily have been a premonition of danger. Fruits were growing among the trees, and some of these he saw that Manu the monkey ate. Being hungry, he swung to the lower branches and, amidst the great chattering of the monkeys, proceeded to eat such of the fruit as he saw the monkeys ate in safety. When he had partially satisfied his hunger, for meat alone could fully do so, he looked about him for Numa of the pit to discover that the lion had gone. End of chapter 16. Recording by Dan Mason of Midland, Michigan. Chapter 17 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Mason. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 17. The Walled City. Dropping to the ground once more, he picked up the trail of the girl and her captors, which he followed easily along what appeared to be a well-beaten trail. It was not long before he came to a small stream, where he quenched his thirst, and thereafter he saw the trail followed in a general direction of the stream, which ran southwesterly. Here and there were cross trails and others which joined the main avenue, and always upon each of them were the tracks and scents of the great cats, of Numa the lion and Sheeta the panther. With the exception of a few small rodents, there appeared to be no other wildlife on the surface of the valley. There was no indication of Bara the deer, or Horta the boar, or Gorgo the buffalo, Buto, Tantor, or Duro. Hista the snake was there. He saw him in the trees in greater numbers than he had ever seen Hista before. and once, beside a reedy pool, he caught a scent that could have belonged to none other than Gimla the crocodile, but upon none of these did the Tarmangani care to feed. And so, as he craved meat, he turned his attention to the birds above. His assailants of the night before had not disarmed him. Either in the darkness and the rush of charging lions, the human foe had overlooked him, or else they had considered him dead. But whatever the reason, he still retained his weapon, his spear and his long knife, his bow and arrows, and his grass rope. Fitting a shaft to his bow, Tarzan awaited an opportunity to bring down one of the larger birds, and when the opportunity finally presented itself, he drove the arrow straight to its mark. As the gaily plumaged creature fluttered to the earth, its companions and the little monkey set up a most terrific chorus of wails and screaming protests. The whole forest became suddenly a babel of hoarse screams and shrill shrieks. Tarzan would not have been surprised had one or two birds in the immediate vicinity given voice to terror as they fled, but that the whole life of the jungle should set up so weird a protest filled him with disgust. It was an angry face that he turned up towards the monkeys and the birds as they were suddenly stirred within him a savage inclination to voice his displeasure in his answer to what he considered their challenge. And so it was that there broke upon the jungle for the first time Tarzan's hideous scream of victory and challenge. The effect upon the creatures above him was instantaneous. Where before the air had trembled to the din of their voices, now utter silence reigned, and a moment later the ape-man was alone with his puny kill. The silence following so closely the previous tumult carried a sinister impression to the ape-man, which still further aroused his anger. Picking the bird from where it had fallen, he withdrew his arrow from the body and returned it to its quiver. Then, with his knife, he quickly and deftly removed the skin and feathers together. He ate angrily, growling as though actually menaced by a nearby foe, and, perhaps too, his growls were partially induced by the fact that he did not care for the flesh of birds. Better this, however, than nothing, and from what his senses had told him, there was no flesh in the vicinity such as he was accustomed to and cared most for. How would he have enjoyed a juicy haunch from Paco the zebra, or a steak from the loin of Gorgo the buffalo? The very thought made his mouth water and increased his resentment against this unnatural forest that harbored no such delicious quarry. He had but partially consumed his kill when he suddenly became aware of a movement in the brush at no great distance from him and downwind, and a moment later his nostrils picked up the scent of Numa from the opposite direction, and then upon either side he caught the fall of padded feet and the brushing of bodies against leafy branches. The ape-man smiled. What stupid creatures did they think him, to be surprised by such clumsy stalkers? Gradually, the sound and sense indicated that lions were moving upon him from all directions, that he was in the center of a steadily converging circle of beasts. Evidently, they were so sure of their prey that they were making no effort toward stealth, for he heard twigs crack beneath their feet and the brushing of their bodies against the vegetation through which they forced their way. He wondered what could have brought them. It seemed unreasonable to believe that the cries of birds and the monkeys should have summoned them, and yet, if not, it was indeed a remarkable coincidence. His judgment told him that the death of a single bird in this forest, which teemed with birds, could scarce be a sufficient moment to warrant that which followed. Yet, even in the face of reason and past experience, he found that the whole affair perplexed him. He stood in the center of the trail awaiting the coming of the lions, and wondering what would be the method of their attack, or if they would indeed attack. Presently, a maned lion came into view along the trail below him. At sight of him, the lion halted. The beast was similar to those that had attacked him earlier in the day, a trifle larger and a trifle darker than the lions of his native jungles, but neither so large nor so black as Numa of the pit. Presently, he distinguished the outlines of other lions in the surrounding brush and among the trees. Each of them halted as it came within sight of the ape-man, and there they stood regarding him in silence. Tarzan wondered how long it would be before they charged, and while he waited, he resumed his feeding, though with every sense constantly alert. One by one the lions lay down, but always their faces were toward him and their eyes upon him. There had been no growling and no roaring, just the quiet drawing of the silent circle about him. it was also entirely foreign to anything that Tarzan ever before had seen lions do, that it irritated him so that presently, having finished his repast, he fell to making insulting remarks to first one and then another of the lions, after the habit he had learned from the apes of his childhood. Dango, eater of carrion, he called them, and he compared them most unfavorably with Hista the snake, the most loathed and repulsive creature of the jungle. Finally he threw handfuls of earth at them and bits of broken twigs, and then the lions growled and bared their fangs, but none of them advanced. Cowards, Tarzan taunted them. Numa with the heart of Bara the deer. He told them who he was, and after the manner of the jungle folk he boasted as to the horrible things he would do to them, but the lions only lay and watched him. It must have been half an hour after their coming that Tarzan caught in the distance along the trail the sound of footsteps approaching. They were the footsteps of creatures who walked upon two legs, and though Tarzan could catch no scent spoor from that direction, he knew that a man was approaching, nor had he long to wait before his judgment was confirmed by the appearance of a man who halted in the trail directly behind the first lion that Tarzan had seen. At sight of the newcomer, the ape-man realized that here was one similar to those who had given off the unfamiliar scent spoor that he had detected the previous night, and he saw that not only in a manner of scent did the man differ from other human beings with whom Tarzan was familiar. The fellow was strongly built, with the skin of a leathery appearance, like parchment yellowed with age. His hair, which was coal black and 3 or 4 inches in length, grew out stiffly at right angles to his scalp. His eyes were closely set, and the irises densely black and very small, so that the white of his eyeballs showed around them. The man's face was smooth except for a few straggly hairs on his chin and upper lip. The nose was aquiline and fine, but the hair grew so far down the forehead as to suggest a very low and brutal type. The upper lip was short and fine, while the lower lip was rather heavy and inclined to be pendulous, the chin being equally weak. Altogether, the face carried the suggestion of once strong and handsome countenance entirely altered by physical violence or by degraded habits and thoughts. The man's arms were long, though not abnormally so, while his legs were short, though straight. He was clothed in tight-fitting nether garments and a loose, sleeveless tunic that fell just below his hips, while his feet were shod in soft-soled sandals, the wrappings of which extended halfway to his knees, closely resembling a modern spiral military legging. He carried a short, heavy spear, and at his side swung a weapon that at first so astonished the ape-man that he could scarcely believe the evidence of his senses: a heavy saber in a leather-covered scabbard. The man's tunic appeared to have been fabricated upon a loom. It was certainly not made of skins, while the garments had covered his legs were quite as evidently made from the hides of rodents. Tarzan noted the utter unconcern with which the man approached the lions, and the equal indifference of Numa to him. The fellow paused for a moment as though appraising the ape-man, and then pushed on past the lions, brushing against the tawny hide as he passed him on the trail. About 20 feet from Tarzan the man stopped, addressing the former in a strange jargon, no syllable of which was intelligible to the Tarmangani. His gestures indicated numerous references to the lions surrounding them, and once he touched his spear with the forefinger of his left hand, and twice he struck the saber at his hip. While he spoke, Tarzan studied the fellow closely, with the result that there fastened himself upon his mind a strange conviction that the man who addressed him was what might only be described as a rational maniac. As the thought came to the ape-man, he could not but smile. So paradoxical the description seemed. Yet a closer study of the man's features, carriage, and the contour of his head carried almost incontrovertibly the assurance that he was insane, while the tones of his voice and his gestures resembled those of a sane and intelligent mortal. Presently the man had concluded his speech and appeared to be waiting questioningly Tarzan's reply. The ape-man spoke to the other first in the language of the great apes, but he soon saw that the words carried no conviction to his listener. Then, with equal futility, he tried several native dialects, but to none of these did the man respond. By this time Tarzan began to lose patience. He had wasted sufficient time by the road, and as he had never depended much upon speech in the accomplishment of his ends, he now raised his spear and advanced towards the other. This evidently was a language common to both, for instantly the fellow raised his own weapon, and at the same time a low call broke from his lips, a call which instantly brought to action every lion in the hitherto silent circle. A volley of roars shattered the silence of the forest, and simultaneously lions sprang into view upon all sides as they closed in rapidly upon their quarry. The man who had called them stepped back, his teeth bared in a mirthless grin. It was then that Tarzan first noticed that the fellow's upper canines were unusually long and exceedingly sharp. It was just a flashing glimpse he got of them as he leapt agilely from the ground and, to the consternation of both the lions and their master, disappeared in the foliage of the lower terrace. Flinging back over his shoulder as he swung rapidly away, "I am Tarzan of the Apes, mighty hunter, mighty fighter. None in the jungle more powerful, none more cunning than Tarzan." A short distance beyond the point at which they had surrounded him, Tarzan came to the trail again and sought for the spoor of Bertha Kircher and Lieutenant Smith Oldwick. He found them quickly and continued upon his search for the two. The spoor lay directly along the trail for another half-mile, when the way suddenly debouched from the forest into open land, and there broke upon the astonished view of the ape-man the domes and minarets of a walled city. Directly before him, in the wall nearest him, Tarzan saw a low arched gateway to which a well-beaten trail led from that which he had been following. In the open space between the forest and the city walls, quantities of garden stuff was growing, while before him at his feet, in an open man-made ditch, ran a stream of water. The plants in the garden were laid out in well-spaced, symmetrical rows and appeared to have been given excellent attention and cultivation. Tiny streams were trickling between the rows from the main ditch before him, and at some distance to his right he could see people at work among the plants. The city wall appeared to be about 35 feet in height, its plastered expanse unbroken except by occasional embrasures. Beyond the wall rose the domes of several structures, and numerous minarets dotted the skyline of the city. The largest and central dome appeared to be gilded, while others were red or blue or yellow. The architecture of the wall itself was of uncompromising simplicity. It was of a cream shade and appeared to be plastered and painted. At its base was a line of well-tended shrubs, and at some distance toward the eastern extremity it was vine-covered to the top. As he stood in the shadow of the trail, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the picture before him, he became aware of the approach of a party in his rear, and there was borne to him the scent of the man and the lions whom he had so readily escaped. Taking to the trees, Tarzan moved a short distance to the west, and finding a comfortable crotch at the edge of the forest where he could watch the trail leading through the gardens to the city gate, he waited the return of his would-be captors. And soon they came, the strange man followed by the pack of great lions. Like dogs, they moved along behind him down the trail among the gardens to the gate. Here the man struck upon the panels of the door with the butt of his spear, and when it opened in response to his signal, he passed in with the lions. Beyond the open door, Tarzan, from his distant perch, caught but a fleeting glimpse of life within the city, just enough to indicate that there were other human creatures who abode there, and then the door closed. Through that door, he knew that the girl and the man whom he sought to succor had been taken into the city. What fate lay in store for them, or whether it already had been meted out to them, he could not even guess. Nor where within that forbidding wall they were incarcerated he could not know. But of one thing he was assured, that if he were to aid them, he could not do it from outside the wall. He must gain entrance to the city first, nor did he doubt that once within, his keen senses would eventually reveal the whereabouts of those whom he sought. The low sun was casting long shadows across the gardens when Tarzan saw the workers returning from the eastern field. A man came first, and as he came he lowered little gates along the large ditch of running water, shutting off the streams that had run between the rows of growing plants. Behind him came other men carrying burdens of fresh vegetables in great woven baskets upon their shoulders. Tarzan had not realized that there had been so many men working in the field, but now as he sat there at the close of the day he saw a procession filling in from the east, bearing the tools and the produce back into the city. And then, to gain a better view, the ape-man ascended to the topmost branches of a tall tree where he overlooked the near wall. From this point of vantage, he saw that the city was long and narrow, and that while the outer walls formed a perfect rectangle, the streets within were winding. Towards the center of the city, there appeared to be a low, white building around which the larger edifices of the city had been built, and there, in the fast waning light, Tarzan thought that between the two buildings he caught the glint of water, but of that he was not sure. His experience of the centers of civilization naturally inclined him to believe that this central area was a plaza about which the larger buildings were grouped, and that there would be the most logical place to search first for Bertha Kircher and her companion. And then the sun went down and darkness quickly enveloped the city, a darkness that was accentuated for the ape-man rather than relieved by the artificial lights which immediately appeared in many of the windows visible to him. Tarzan had noticed that the roofs of most of the buildings were flat, the few exceptions being those of what he imagined to be the more pretentious public structures. How the city had come to exist in this foreign part of unexplored Africa, the ape-man could not conceive. Better than another, he realized something of the unsolved secret of the great dark continent, enormous areas of which have yet been untouched by the foot of civilized man. Yet he could scarce believe that a city of this size, and apparently thus well constructed, could have existed for the generations that it must have been there without intercourse with the outer world. Even though it surrounded by a trackless desert waste, as he knew it to be, he could not conceive that generation after generation of men could be born and die there without attempting to solve the mysteries of the world beyond the confines of their little valley. And yet, here was a city surrounded by tilled land and filled with people. With the coming of night, there arose throughout the jungle the cries of the great cats. The voice of Numa blended with that of Sheeta, and the thunderous roars of the great males reverberated through the forest until the earth trembled, and from within the city came the answering roars of other lions. A simple plan for gaining entrance to the city had occurred to Tarzan, and now that darkness had fallen, he set about to put it into effect. Its success hinged entirely upon the strength of the vines he had seen surmounting the wall towards the east. In this direction he had made his way, while out of the forest about him the cries of flesh-eaters increased in volume and ferocity. A quarter of a mile intervened between the forest and the city wall, a quarter of a mile of cultivated land, unrelieved by a single tree. Tarzan the Apes realized his limitations, and so he knew that it would undoubtedly spell death for him to be caught in the open space by one of the great black lions of the forest if, as he had already surmised, Numa the Pit was a specimen of the forest lion of the valley. He must therefore depend entirely upon his cunning and his speed, and upon the chance that the vine would sustain his weight. He moved through the middle terrace, where the way is always easiest, until he reached a point opposite the vine-clad portion of the wall, and there he waited, listening and scenting until he might assure himself that there was no Numa within his immediate vicinity, or at least none that sought him. And when he was quite sure that there was no lion close by in the forest, and none in the clearing between himself and the wall, he dropped lightly to the ground and moved stealthily out into the open. The rising moon, just topping the eastern cliffs, cast its bright rays upon the long stretch of open garden beneath the wall, and, too, it picked out in clear relief for any curious eyes that chanced to be cast in that direction the figure of the giant ape-man moving across the clearing. It was only chance, of course, that a great lion hunting at the edge of the forest saw the figure of the man halfway between the forest and the wall. Suddenly there broke upon Tarzan's ears a menacing sound. It was not the roar of a hungry lion, but the roar of a lion in rage, and as he glanced back in the direction from which the sound came, he saw a huge beast moving out from the shadow of the forest towards him. Even in the moonlight and at a distance, Tarzan saw that the lion was huge, that it was indeed another of the black-maned monsters similar to Numa the Pit. For an instant, he was impelled to turn in flight, but at the same time, he thought of the helpless girl imprisoned in the city flashed through his brain, and, without an instant's hesitation, Tarzan the Apes wheeled and ran for the wall. Then it was that Numa charged. Numa, the lion, can run swiftly for a short distance, but he lacks endurance. For the period of an ordinary charge, he can cover the ground with greater rapidity, possibly, than any other creature in the world. Tarzan, on the other hand, could run at great speed for long distances, though never as rapidly as Numa when the latter charged. The question of his fate, then, rested upon whether, with his start, he could elude Numa for a few seconds, and if so, if the lion would then have sufficient stamina remaining to pursue him at a reduced gait for the balance of the distance to the wall. Never before, perhaps, was staged a more thrilling race, and yet it was run with only the moon and stars to see. Alone and in silence the two beasts sped across the moonlight clearing. Numa gained with appalling rapidity upon the fleeing man, yet at every bound Tarzan was nearer to the vine-clad wall. Once the ape-man glanced back. Numa was so close upon him that it seemed inevitable that at the next bound he should drag him down. So close was he that the ape-man drew his knife as he ran, that he might at least give a good account of himself in the last moments of his life. But Numa had reached the limit of his speed and endurance. Gradually he dropped behind, but he did not give up the pursuit, and now Tarzan realized how much hinged upon the strength of the untested vines. If, at the inception of the race, only Goro and the stars had looked down upon the contestants, such was not the case at the finish, since from the embrasure near the summit of the wall, two close-set black eyes peered down upon the two. Tarzan was a dozen yards ahead of Numa when he reached the wall. There was no time to stop and institute a search for sturdy stems and safe handholds. His fate was in the hands of chance. With the realization, he gave a final spurt and, running cat-like up the side of the wall among the vines, sought with his hands for something that would sustain his weight. Below him, Numa leapt also. End of chapter 17. Recording by Dan Mason of Midland, Michigan. Chapter 18 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Mason. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 18. Among the Maniacs. As the lion swarmed over her protectors, Bertha Kircher shrank back in the cave in a momentary paralysis of fright superinduced, perhaps, by the long days of terrific nerve strain which she had undergone. Mingled with the roars of the lions had been the voices of men, and presently, out of the confusion and turmoil, she felt the near presence of a human being, and then hands reached forth and seized her. It was dark and she could see but little, nor any sign of the English officer or the ape-man. The man who seized her kept the lions from her with what appeared to be a stout spear, the haft of which he used to beat off the beasts. The fellow dragged her from the cavern, the while he shouted what appeared to be commands and warnings to the lions. Once out upon the light sands of the bottom of the gorge, objects became more distinguishable, and then she saw that there were other men in the party, and that two half led and half carried the stumbling figure of a third, whom she guessed must be Smith Oldwick. For a time the lions made frenzied efforts to reach the two captives, but always the men with them succeeded in beating them off. The fellows seemed utterly unafraid of the great beasts leaping and snarling about them, handling them as much as the same one might handle a pack of obstreperous dogs. Along the bed of the old watercourse that once ran through the gorge they made their way, and as the first faint lighting of the eastern horizon presaged the coming dawn, they paused for a moment upon the edge of a declivity, which appeared to the girl in the strange light of the waning night as a vast bottomless pit. But as her captors resumed their way, and the night of the new day became stronger, she saw that they were moving downward towards a dense forest. Once beneath the overarching trees, all was again Cimmerian darkness, nor was the gloom relieved until the sun finally arose beyond the eastern cliffs, when she saw that they were following what appeared to be a broad and well-beaten game trail through a forest of great trees. The ground was unusually dry for an African forest, and the underbrush, while heavily foliaged, was not nearly so rank and impenetrable as that which she had been accustomed to find in similar woods. It was as though the trees and the bushes grew in a waterless country, nor was there the musty odor of decaying vegetation or the myriad of tiny insects such as are bred in damp places. As they proceeded and the sun rose higher, the the voices of the arboreal jungle life rose in discordant notes and a loud chattering about them. Innumerable monkeys scolded and screamed in the branches overhead, while harsh-voiced birds of brilliant plumage darted hither and thither. She noticed presently that their captors often cast apprehensive glances in the direction of the birds, and on numerous occasions seemed to be addressing the winged denizens of the forest. One incident made a marked impression on her. The man who immediately preceded her was a fellow of powerful build, yet when a brilliantly colored parrot swooped down towards him, he dropped upon his knees and covering his face with his arms bent forward until his head touched the ground. Some of the others looked at him and laughed nervously. Presently the man glanced upward, and seeing that the bird was gone, rose to his feet and continued along the trail. It was at this brief halt that Smith Oldwick was brought to her side by the man who had been supporting him. He had been rather badly mauled by one of the lions, but was now able to walk alone, though he was extremely weak from shock and loss of blood. "Pretty mess, what?" he remarked with a wry smile, indicating his bloody and disheveled state. "It is terrible," said the girl. "I hope you are not suffering." "Not as much as I should have expected," he replied, "but I feel as weak as a fool. What sort of creatures are these beggars, anyway?" "I don't know," she replied. "There's something terribly uncanny about their appearance." The man regarded one of their captors closely for a moment and then, turning to the girl, asked, "Did you ever visit a madhouse?" She looked up at him in a quick understanding and with a horrified expression in her eyes. "That's it!" she cried. "They have all the earmarks," he said. "Whites of the eyes showing all around the irises, hair growing stiffly erect from the scalp and low down on the forehead. Even their mannerisms and their carriage are those of maniacs." The girl shuddered. "Another thing about them," continued the Englishman, "that doesn't appear normal is that they are afraid of parrots and utterly fearless of lions." "Yes," said the girl. "And did you notice that the birds seemed utterly fearless of them? Really seemed to hold them in contempt. Have you any idea of what language they speak?" "No," said the man. "I've been trying to figure that out. It's not like any of the few native dialects of which I have any knowledge." "It doesn't sound at all like the native language," said the girl, "but there's something familiar about it. You know, every now and then I feel that I'm just on the verge of understanding what they're saying, or at least that somewhere I've heard their tongue before, but final recognition always eludes me." "I doubt if you ever heard their language spoken," said the man. "These people must have lived in this out-of-the-way valley for ages, and even if they had retained the original language of their ancestors without change, which is doubtful, it must be some tongue that is no longer spoken in the outer world." At one point where the stream of water crossed the trail, the party halted while the lions and the men drank. They motioned to their captives to drink too, and as Bertha Kircher and Smith Oldwick, lying prone upon the ground, drank from the clear, cool water of the rivulet, they were suddenly startled by the thunderous roar of a lion a short distance ahead of them. Instantly the lions with them set up a hideous response, moving restlessly to and fro with their eyes always either turned in the direction from which the roar had come or towards their master, against whom the tawny beast slunk. The men loosened the sabers in their scabbards, the weapons that had aroused Smith Oldwick's curiosity as they had Tarzan's, and grasped their spears more firmly. Evidently there were lions and lions, and while they evidenced no fear of the beast which accompanied them, it was quite evident that the voice of the newcomer had an entirely different effect upon them. Although the men seemed less terrified than the lions, neither, however, showed any indication of an inclination to flee. On the contrary, the entire party advanced along the trail in the direction of the menacing roars, and presently there appeared in the center of the path a black lion of gigantic proportions. To Smith Oldwick and the girl he appeared to be the same lion that they had encountered at the plain and from which Tarzan had rescued them, but it was not Numa of the pit, although he resembled him closely. The black beast stood directly in the center of the trail, lashing his tail and growling menacingly at the advancing party. The men urged on their own beasts, who growled and whined but hesitated to charge. Evidently becoming impatient and in full consciousness of his might, the intruder raised his tail stiffly erect and shot forward. Several of the defending lions made a half-hearted attempt to obstruct his passage, but they might as well have placed themselves in the path of an express train, as hurling them aside the great beast leapt straight for one of the men. A dozen spears were launched at him, and a dozen sabers leapt from their scabbards. Gleaming, razor-edged weapons they were, but for an instant rendered futile by the terrific speed of the charging beast. Two of the spears entered his body, but served to further enrage him, as with demoniacal roars he sprang upon the hapless man he had singled out for his prey. Scarcely pausing in his charge, he seized the fellow by the shoulder and, turning quickly at right angles, leapt into the concealing foliage that flanked the trail, and was gone, bearing his victim with him. So quickly had the whole occurrence transpired that the formation of the little party was scarcely altered. There had been no opportunity for flight, even if it had been contemplated, and now that the lion was gone with his prey, the men made no move to pursue him. They paused only long enough to recall the 2 or 3 of their lions that had scattered, and then resumed the march along the trail. "Might be an everyday occurrence from all the effect it has on them," remarked Smith Oldwick to the girl. "Yes," she said. "They seem to be neither surprised nor disconcerted, and evidently they're quite sure that the lion, having got what he came for, will not molest them further." "I had thought," said the Englishman, "that the lions of the Wamabo country were about the most ferocious in existence, but they're regular tabby cats by comparison with these big black fellows. Did you ever see anything more utterly fearless or more terribly irresistible than that charge?" For a while, as they walked side by side, their thoughts and conversation centered upon this latest experience, until the trail emerged from the forest, opened to their view a walled city and an area of cultivated land. Neither could suppress an exclamation of surprise. "Why, that wall is a regular engineering job!" exclaimed Smith Oldwick. "And look at the domes and minarets of the city beyond!" cried the girl. "There must be civilized people beyond that wall. Possibly we are fortunate to have fallen into their hands." Smith Oldwick shrugged his shoulders. "I hope so," he said, "though I'm not at all sure about people who travel about with lions and are afraid of parrots. There must be something wrong with them." The party followed the trail across the field to an arched gateway which opened at the summons of one of their captors, who beat upon the heavy wooden panels with his spear. Beyond, the gate opened into a narrow street which seemed but a continuation of the jungle trail leading from the forest. Buildings on either hand adjoined the wall and fronted the narrow, winding street, which was only visible for a short distance ahead. The houses were practically all 2-storied structures, the upper stories flush with the street, while the walls of the first story were set back some 10 feet. A series of simple columns and arches supporting the front of the second story and forming an arcade on either side of the narrow thoroughfare. The pathway in the center of the street was unpaved, but the floors of the arcades were cut stone of various shapes and sizes, but all carefully fitted and laid without mortar. These floors gave evidence of great antiquity, there being a distinct depression down the center, as though the stone had been worn away by the passage of countless sandaled feet during the ages that it had lain there. There were few people astir at this early hour, and these were the same type as their captors. At first, those whom they saw were only men, but as they went deeper into the city, they came upon a few naked children playing in the soft dust of the roadway. Many they passed showed the greatest surprise and curiosity in the prisoners, and often made inquiries of the guards, which the 2 assumed must have been in relation to themselves, while the others appeared not to notice them at all. "I wish we could understand their Bali language," exclaimed Smith Oldwick. "Yes," said the girl. "I would like to ask them what they're going to do with us." "That would be interesting," said the man. "I've been doing considerable wondering along that line myself." "I don't like the way their canine teeth are filed," said the girl. "It's too suggestive of some of the cannibals I've seen." "You don't really believe they are cannibals, do you?" asked the man. "You don't think white people are ever cannibals, do you?" "Are these people white?" asked the girl. "They're not Negroes, that's certain," rejoined the man. "Their skin is yellow, but yet it doesn't resemble the Chinese exactly, nor are any of their features Chinese." It was at this juncture that they caught their first glimpse of a native woman. She was similar in most respects to the men, though her stature was smaller and her figure was more symmetrical. Her face was more repulsive than that of the men, possibly because of the fact that she was a woman, which rather accentuated the idiosyncrasy of the eyes. Pendulous lips, pointed tusks, and a stiff, low-growing hair. The latter was longer than that of the men and much heavier. It hung about her shoulders and was confined by a colored bit of some lacy fabric. Her single garment appeared to be nothing more than a flimsy scarf which was wound tightly around her body from below her naked breasts, being caught up some way in the bottom near her ankles. Bits of shiny metal resembling gold ornamented both the headdress and the skirt. Otherwise, the woman was entirely without jewelry. Her bare arms were slender and shapely, and her hands and feet were well proportioned and symmetrical. She came close to the party as they passed her, jabbering to the guards who paid no attention to her. The prisoners had an opportunity to observe her closely as she followed at their side for a short distance. "The figure of a houri," remarked Smith Oldwick, "with the face of an imbecile." The street they followed was intersected at irregular intervals by crossroads, which, as they glanced down them, proved to be as equally tortuous as that through which they were being conducted. The houses varied, but with little in design. Occasionally there were bits of color or some attempt at other architectural ornamentation. Through open windows and doors, they could see that the walls of the houses were very thick and that all the apertures were quite small, as though the people had built against extreme heat, which they realized must have been necessary in this valley buried deep in an African desert. Ahead, they occasionally caught glimpses of larger structures, and as they approached them, came upon what was evidently a part of the business section of the city. There were numerous small shops and bazaars interspersed among the residences, and over the doors of these were signs painted in characters strongly suggesting Greek origin, and yet it was not Greek, as both the Englishman and the girl knew. Smith Oldwick was by this time beginning to feel more acute to the pain of his wounds and the consequent weakness that was greatly aggravated by the loss of blood. He staggered now occasionally, and the girl, seeing his plight, offered him her arm. "No," he expostulated, "you have passed through too much yourself to have an extra burden imposed upon you." But though he made a valiant effort to keep up with their captors, he occasionally lagged, and upon one such occasion the guards for the first time showed a disposition towards brutality. It was a big fellow who walked at Smith Oldwick's left. Several times he took hold of the Englishman's arm and pushed him forward, not urgently, but when the captive lagged again and again, the fellow suddenly, and certainly with no just provocation, flew into a perfect frenzy of rage. He leapt upon the wounded man, striking him viciously with his fists and bearing him to the ground, grasping his throat in his left hand while his right he drew his long sharp saber. Screaming terribly, he waved the blade over his head. The others stopped and turned to look upon the encounter with no particular show of interest. It was as though one of the party had paused to readjust a sandal, and the others merely waited until he was ready to march on again. But if their captors were indifferent, Bertha Kircher was not. The close-set, blazing eyes, the snarling, fanged face, and the frightful screams filled her with horror, while the brutal and wanton attack upon the wounded man aroused within her the spirit of protection for the weak that is inherent in all women. Forgetful of everything other than that a weak and defenseless man was being brutally murdered before her eyes, the girl cast aside discretion and, rushing to Smith Oldwick's assistance, seized the uplifted sword arm of the shrieking creature upon the prostrate Englishman. Clinging desperately to the fellow, she surged backward with all her weight and strength, with the result that she overbalanced him and sent him sprawling to the pavement on his back. In his effort to save himself, he relaxed his grasp upon the grip of his saber, which had no sooner fallen to the ground than it was seized upon by the girl. Standing erect beside the prostrate form of the English officer, Bertha Kircher, the razor-edged weapon grasped firmly in her hand, faced their captors. She was a brave figure. Even her soiled and torn riding togs and disheveled hair detracted nothing from her appearance. The creature she had felled scrambled quickly to his feet, and in the instant his whole demeanor changed. From demoniacal rage he became suddenly convulsed with hysterical laughter, although it was a question in the girl's mind as to which was the more terrifying. His companions stood looking on with vacuous grins upon their countenances, while he, from whom the girl had wrested the weapon, leapt up and down shrieking with laughter. If Bertha Kircher had needed further evidence to assure her that they were in the hands of a mentally deranged people, the man's present actions would have been sufficient to convince her. The sudden uncontrolled rage, and now equally uncontrolled and mirthless laughter, but emphasized the facial attributes of idiocy. Suddenly realizing how helpless she was in the event any one of the men should seek to overpower her, and moved by a sudden revulsion of feeling that brought on almost a nausea of disgust, the girl hurled the weapon upon the ground at the feet of the laughing maniac, and turning, kneeled beside the Englishman. "It was wonderful of you," he said, "but you shouldn't have done it. Don't antagonize them. I believe they are all mad, and you know they say that one should always humor a madman." She shook her head. "I couldn't see him kill you," she said. A sudden light sprang into the man's eyes as he reached out a hand and grasped the girl's fingers. "Do you care a little now?" he asked. "Can you tell me that you do? Just a bit?" She did not withdraw her hand from his, but she shook her head sadly. "Please don't," she said. "I am sorry that I can only like you very much." The light died from his eyes and his fingers relaxed their grasp on hers. "Please forgive me," he murmured. "I intended waiting until we got out of this mess and you were safe among your own people. It must have been the shock or something like that, and seeing you defending me as you did. Anyway, I couldn't help it, and really it doesn't make much difference what I say now, does it?" "What do you mean?" she asked quickly. He shrugged and smiled ruefully. "I will never leave this city alive," he said. "I wouldn't mention it except that I realize that you must know it as well as I. I was pretty badly torn up by the lion, and this fellow here has about finished me. There might be some hope if we were among civilized people, but here, with these frightful creatures, what care could we get even if they were friendly?" Bertha Kircher knew that he spoke the truth, and yet she could not bring herself to an admission that Smith Oldwick would die. She was fond of him. In fact, her great regret was that she did not love him, but she knew that she did not. It seemed to her that it could be such an easy thing for any girl to love Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick, an English officer and a gentleman, the scion of an old family, and himself a man of ample means, young, good-looking, and infallible. What more could a girl ask for the day of such a man love her, and that she possessed Smith Oldwick's love there was no doubt in Bertha Kircher's mind. She sighed, and then, laying her hand impulsively on his forehead, she whispered, "Do not give up hope, though. Try to live for my sake, and for your sake I will try to love you." It was as though new life had suddenly been injected into the man's veins. His face lightened instantly, and with strength that he himself did not know he possessed, he rose slowly to his feet, albeit somewhat unsteadily. The girl helped him and supported him after he had arisen. For the moment they had been entirely unconscious of their surroundings, and now as she looked at their captors she saw that they had fallen again into their almost habitual manner of stolid indifference, and at a gesture from one of them the march was resumed as though no untoward incident had occurred. Bertha Kircher experienced a sudden reaction from the momentary exaltation of her recent promise to the Englishman. She knew that she had spoken more for him than for herself, but now that it was over she realized, as she had realized the moment before she had spoken, that it was unlikely she would ever care for him the way he wished. But what had she promised? Only that she would try to love him. And now, she asked herself, she realized that there might be little hope of their ever returning to civilization. Even if these people should prove to be friendly and willing to let them depart in peace, how would they to find their way back to the coast? With Tarzan dead, as she fully believed him after seeing his body lying lifeless at the mouth of the cave when she had been dragged forth by her captor, there seemed no power at their command which could guide them safely. The two had scarcely mentioned the ape-man since their capture, for each realized fully what his loss meant to them. They had compared notes relative to those few exciting moments of the final attack and capture, and had found that they agreed perfectly upon all that had occurred. Smith Oldwick had even seen the lion leap upon Tarzan at the instant that the former was awakened by the roars of the charging beasts, and though the night had been dark, he had been able to see that the body of the savage ape-man had never moved from the instant that it had come down beneath the beast. And so, if at other times within the past few weeks Bertha Kircher had felt that her situation was particularly hopeless, she was now ready to admit that hope was absolutely extinct. The streets were beginning to fill with strange men and women of this strange city. Sometimes individuals would notice them and seem to take a great interest in them, and again others would pass with vacant stares, seemingly unconscious of their immediate surroundings and paying no attention whatsoever to the prisoners. Once they heard hideous screams up a side street, and looking they saw a man in the throes of a demoniacal outburst of rage, similar to that which she had witnessed in the recent attack upon Smith Oldwick. This creature was venting his insane rage upon a child which he repeatedly struck and bit, pausing only long enough to shriek at frequent intervals. Finally, just before they passed out of sight, the creature raised the limp body of the child high above his head and cast it down with all his strength upon the pavement, and then, wheeling and screaming madly at the top of his lungs, he dashed headlong up the winding street. 2 women and several men had stood looking on at the cruel attack. They were at too great a distance for the Europeans to know whether their facial expressions portrayed pity or rage, but be that as it may, none offered to interfere. A few yards farther on, a hideous hag leaned from a second-story window where she laughed and gibbered and made horrid grimaces to all who passed her. Others went their ways, apparently attending to whatever duties called them, and soberly as the inhabitants of any civilized community. "God," muttered Smith Oldwick, "what an awful place." The girl turned suddenly towards him. "You still have your pistol?" she asked him. "Yes," he replied. "I tucked it inside my shirt. They did not search me, and it was so dark for them to see whether I carried any weapon or not, so I hid it in the hope that I might get through with it." She moved closer to him and took hold of his hand. "Save 1 cartridge for me, please," she begged. Smith Oldwick looked down at her and blinked his eyes very rapidly, and unfamiliar and disconcerting moisture had come into them. He had realized, of course, how bad a plight was theirs, but somehow it had seemed to affect him only. It did not seem possible that anyone could harm this sweet and beautiful girl, and that she should have to be destroyed by him. It was too hideous. It was unbelievable, unthinkable. If he had been filled with apprehension before, he was doubly perturbed now. "I don't believe I could do it, Bertha," he said. "Not even to save me from something worse?" she asked. He shook his head dismally. "I could never do it," he replied. The street that they were following suddenly opened upon a wide avenue, and before them spread a broad and beautiful lagoon, the quiet surface of which mirrored the clear cerulean of the sky. Here the aspect of all their surroundings changed. The buildings were higher and much more pretentious in design and ornamentation. The street itself was paved in mosaics of barbaric but stunningly beautiful design. In the ornamentation of the buildings there was considerable color and a great deal of what appeared to be gold leaf. In all the decorations there was utilized in various ways the conventional figure of the parrot, and, to a lesser extent, that of the lion and the monkey. Their captors led them along the pavement beside the lagoon for a short distance, and then through an arched doorway into one of the buildings facing the avenue. Here, directly within the entrance, was a large room furnished with massive benches and tables, many of which were elaborately hand-carved with the figures of the inevitable parrot, the lion, or the monkey, the parrot always predominating. Behind one of the tables sat a man who differed in no way that the captives could discover from those who accompanied them. Before this person the party halted, and one of the men who had brought them made what seemed to be an oral report. Whether they were before a judge, a military officer, or a civil dignitary, they could not know, but evidently he was a man of authority, for, after listening to whatever recital was being made to him, the while he closely scrutinized the 2 captives, he made a single futile attempt to converse with them, and then issued some curt orders to him who had made the report. Almost immediately, 2 of the men approached Bertha Kircher and signaled her to accompany them. Smith Oldwick started to follow her, but was intercepted by one of their guards. The girl stopped then and turned back, at the same time looking at the man at the table and making signs with her hands, indicating, as best she could, that she wished Smith Oldwick to remain with her, but the fellow only shook his head negatively and motioned to the guards to remove her. The Englishman again attempted to follow, but was restrained. He was too weak and helpless to even make an attempt to enforce his wishes. He thought of the pistol inside his shirt, and then of the futility of attempting to overcome an entire city with the few rounds of ammunition left to him. So far, with the single exception of the attack made upon him, they had no reason to believe that they might not receive fair treatment from their captors, and so he reasoned that it might be wiser to avoid antagonizing them until such a time as he became thoroughly convinced that their intentions were entirely hostile. He saw the girl led from the building, and just before she disappeared from his view, she turned and waved her hand to him. "Good luck," she cried, and was gone. The lions that had entered the building with the party had, during their examination by the man at the table, been driven from the apartment through a doorway behind him. Toward this same doorway the two men now led Smith Oldwick. He found himself in a long corridor from the sides of which other doorways opened, presumably into other apartments in the building. At the far end of the corridor he saw a heavy grating beyond which appeared an open courtyard. Into this courtyard the prisoner was conducted, and as he entered it with the two guards he found himself in an opening which was bound by the inner walls of the building. It was in the nature of a garden in which a number of trees and flowering shrubs grew. Beneath several of the trees were benches, and there was a bench along the south wall, but what aroused his most immediate attention was the fact that the lions who had assisted in their capture and who had accompanied them upon the return to the city lay sprawled upon the ground or wandered restlessly to and fro. Just inside the gate his guard halted. The two men exchanged a few words and then turned and re-entered the corridor. The Englishman was horror-stricken as the full realization of his terrible plight forced himself upon his tired brain. He turned and seized the grating in an attempt to open it and gain the safety of the corridor, but he found it securely locked against his every effort. And then he called aloud to the retreating figure of the men within. The only reply he received was a high-pitched, mirthless laugh, and then the two passed through the doorway at the far end of the corridor, and he was alone with the lions. End of Chapter 18. Recording by Dan Mason of Midland, Michigan.
Chapter 19 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 19. The Queen's Story. In the meantime, Bertha Kircher was conducted the length of the plaza toward the largest and most pretentious of the buildings surrounding it. This edifice covered the entire width of one end of the plaza. It was several stories in height, the main entrance being approached by a wide flight of stone steps, the bottom of which was guarded by enormous stone lions, while at the top there were two pedestals flanking the entrance and of the same height, upon each of which was the stone image of a large parrot. As the girl neared these latter images, she saw that the capital of each column was hewn into the semblance of a human skull upon which the parrots perched. Above the arched doorway and upon the walls of the building were the figures of other parrots, of lions and of monkeys. Some of these were carved in bas relief, others were delineated in mosaics, while still others appeared to have been painted upon the surface of the wall. The colorings of the last were apparently much subdued by age, with the result that the general effect was soft and beautiful. The sculpturing and mosaic work were both finely executed, giving evidence of a high degree of artistic skill. Unlike the first building into which she had been conducted, the entrance to which had been doorless, massive doors closed the entrance which she now approached. In the niches formed by the columns which supported the door's arch, and about the base of the pedestals of the stone parrots, as well as in various other places on the broad stairway, lolled some score of armed men. The tunics of these were all of a vivid yellow, and upon the breast and back of each was embroidered the figure of a parrot. As she was conducted up the stairway, one of these yellow-coated warriors approached and halted her guides at the top of the steps. Here they exchanged a few words, and while they were talking, the girl noticed that he who had halted them, as well as those whom she could see of his companions, appeared to be, if possible, of a lower mentality than her original captors. Their coarse, bristling hair grew so low upon their foreheads as in some instances to almost join their eyebrows, while the irises were smaller, exposing more of the white of the eyeball. After a short parley, the man in charge of the doorway, for such he seemed to be, turned and struck upon one of the panels with the butt of his spear, at the same time calling to several of his companions, who rose and came forward at his command. Soon the great doors commenced slowly to swing creakingly open, and presently, as they separated, the girl saw behind them the motive force which operated the massive doors. To each door a half-dozen naked negroes. At the doorway her 2 guards were turned back and their places taken by a half-dozen of the yellow-coated soldiery. These conducted her through the doorway, which the blacks, pulling upon heavy chains, closed behind them. And as the girl watched them, she noted with horror that the poor creatures were chained by the neck to the doors. Before her led a broad hallway, in the center of which was a little pool of clear water. Here again, in floor and walls, was repeated, in new and ever-changing combinations and designs, the parrots, the monkeys, and the lions, but now many of the figures were of what the girl was convinced must be gold. The walls of the corridor consisted of a series of open archways, through which, upon either side, other spacious apartments were visible. The hallway was entirely unfurnished, but the rooms on either side contained benches and tables. Glimpses of some of the walls revealed the fact that they were covered with hangings of some colored fabric, while upon the floors were thick rugs of barbaric design and the skins of black lions and beautifully marked leopards. The room directly to the right of the entrance was filled with men wearing the yellow tunics of her new guard, while the walls were hung with numerous spears and sabers. At the far end of the corridor, a low flight of steps led to another closed doorway. Here the guard was again halted. One of the guards at this doorway, after receiving the report of one of those who accompanied her, passed through the door, leaving them standing outside. It was fully 15 minutes before he returned, when the guard was again changed and the girl conducted into the chamber beyond. Through 3 other chambers and past 3 more massive doors, at each of which her guard was changed, the girl was conducted before she was ushered into a comparatively small room, back and forth across the floor of which paced a man in a scarlet tunic, upon the front and back of which was embroidered an enormous parrot, and upon whose head was a barbaric headdress surmounted by a stuffed parrot. The walls of this room were entirely hidden by hangings upon which hundreds, even thousands of parrots were embroidered. Inlaid in the floor were golden parrots, while as thickly as they could be painted, upon the ceiling were brilliant-hued parrots with wings outspread as though in the act of flying. The man himself was larger of stature than any she had yet seen within the city. His parchment-like skin was wrinkled with age, and he was much fatter than any other of his kind that she had seen. His bared arms, however, gave evidence of great strength, and his gait was not that of an old man. His facial expression denoted almost utter imbecility, and he was quite the most repulsive creature that ever Bertha Kircher had looked upon. For several minutes after she was conducted into his presence, he appeared not to be aware that she was there, but continued his restless pacing to and fro. Suddenly, without the slightest warning, and while he was at the far end of the room from her with his back toward her, he wheeled and rushed madly at her. Involuntarily the girl shrank back, extending her open palms toward the frightful creature, as though to hold him aloof. But a man upon either side of her, the 2 who had conducted her into the apartment, seized and held her. Although he rushed violently toward her, the man stopped without touching her. For a moment his horrid white-rimmed eyes glared searchingly into her face, immediately following which he burst into maniacal laughter. For 2 or 3 minutes the creature gave himself over to merriment, and then, stopping as suddenly as he had commenced to laugh, he fell to examining the prisoner. He felt of her hair, her skin, the texture of the garment she wore, and by means of signs made her understand she was to open her mouth. In the latter he seemed much interested, calling the attention of one of the guards to her canine teeth, and then baring his own sharp fangs for the prisoner to see. Presently he resumed pacing to and fro across the floor, and it was fully 15 minutes before he again noticed the prisoner, and then it was to issue a curt order to her guards, who immediately conducted her from the apartment. The guards now led the girl through a series of corridors and apartments to a narrow stone stairway which led to the floor above, finally stopping before a small door, where stood a naked negro armed with a spear. At a word from one of her guards, the negro opened the door, and the party passed into a low-ceiled apartment, the windows of which immediately caught the girl's attention through the fact that they were heavily barred. The room was furnished similarly to those that she had seen in other parts of the building, the same carved tables and benches, the rugs upon the floor, the decorations upon the walls, although in every respect it was simpler than anything she had seen on the floor below. In one corner was a low couch covered with a rug similar to those on the floor, except that it was of a lighter texture, and upon this sat a woman. As Bertha Kircher's eyes alighted upon the occupant of the room, the girl gave a little gasp of astonishment, for she recognized immediately that here was a creature more nearly of her own kind than any she had seen within the city's walls. An old woman it was who looked at her through faded blue eyes, sunken deep in a wrinkled and toothless face, but the eyes were those of a sane and intelligent creature, and the wrinkled face was the face of a white woman. At sight of the girl, the woman rose and came forward, her gait so feeble and unsteady that she was forced to support herself with a long staff, which she grasped in both her hands. One of the guards spoke a few words to her, and then the men turned and left the apartment. The girl stood just within the door, waiting in silence for what might next befall her. The old woman crossed the room and stopped before her, raising her weak and watery eyes to the fresh young face of the newcomer. Then she scanned her from head to foot, and once again the old eyes returned to the girl's face. Bertha Kircher, on her part, was not less frank in her survey of the little old woman. It was the latter who spoke first. In a thin, cracked voice she spoke, hesitatingly, falteringly, as though she were using unfamiliar words and speaking a strange tongue. "You are from the outer world?" she asked in English. "God grant that you may speak and understand this tongue." "English?" the girl exclaimed. "Yes, of course I speak English." "Thank God!" cried the little old woman. "I did not know whether I myself might speak it so that another could understand. For 60 years I have spoken only their accursed gibberish. For 60 years I have not heard a word in my native language. Poor creature, she mumbled. "What a cursed misfortune threw you into their hands." "You are an English woman?" asked Bertha Kircher. "Did I understand you right, that you are an English woman and have been here for 60 years?" The old woman nodded her head affirmatively. "For 60 years I have never been outside of this palace. Come," she said, stretching forth a bony hand. "I am very old and cannot stand long. Come and sit with me on my couch." The girl took the proffered hand and assisted the old lady back to the opposite side of the room, and when she was seated, the girl sat down beside her. Poor child, moaned the old woman. "Far better to have died than to have let them bring you here. At first I might have destroyed myself, but there was always the hope that someone would come who would take me away, but none ever comes. Tell me how they got you." Very briefly the girl narrated the principal incidents which led up to her capture by some of the creatures of the city. "Then there is a man with you in the city?" asked the old woman. "Yes," said the girl, "but I do not know where he is, nor what are their intentions in regard to him. In fact, I do not know what their intentions toward me are." "No one might even guess," said the old woman. "They do not know themselves from one minute to the next what their intentions are. But I think you can rest assured, my poor child, that you will never see your friend again. "But they haven't slain you," the girl reminded her. "And you have been their prisoner, you say, for 60 years." "No," replied her companion, "they have not killed me, nor will they kill you. Though God knows, before you have lived long in this horrible place, you will beg them to kill you." "Who are they?" asked Bertha Kircher. "What kind of people? They differ from any that I have ever seen. And tell me, too, how you came here." "It was long ago," said the old woman, rocking back and forth on the couch. "It was long ago. Oh, how long it was! I was only 20 then. Think of it, child. Look at me. I have no mirror other than my bath. I cannot see what I look like, for my eyes are old. But with my fingers I can feel my old and wrinkled face, my sunken eyes, and these flabby lips drawn in over toothless gums. I am old and bent and hideous. But then I was young, and they said that I was beautiful. No, I will not be a hypocrite. I was beautiful. My glass told me that. My father was a missionary in the interior, and one day there came a band of Arabian slave raiders. They took the men and women of the little native village where my father labored, and they took me too. They did not know much about our part of the country, so they were compelled to rely upon the men of our village, whom they had captured, to guide them. They told me that they never before had been so far south, and that they had heard there was a country rich in ivory and slaves west of us. They wanted to go there, and from there they would take us north, where I was to be sold into the harem of some black sultan. They often discussed the price I would bring, and that price might not lessen. They guarded me jealously from one another, so the journeys were made as little fatiguing for me as possible. I was given the best food at their command, and I was not harmed. But after a short time, when we had reached the confines of the country with which the men of our village were familiar, and had entered upon a desolate and arid desert waste, the Arabs realized at last that we were lost. But they still kept on, ever toward the west, crossing hideous gorges and marching across the face of a burning land beneath the pitiless sun. The poor slaves they had captured were, of course, compelled to carry all the camp equipage and loot, and thus heavily burdened, half-starved, and without water, they soon commenced to die like flies. We had not been in the desert land long before the Arabs were forced to kill their horses for food, and when we reached the first gorge, across which it would have been impossible to transport the animals, the balance of them were slaughtered, and the meat loaded upon the poor staggering blacks who still survived. Thus we continued for 2 more days, and now all but a handful of blacks were dead, and the Arabs themselves had commenced to succumb to hunger and thirst and the intense heat of the desert. As far as the eye could reach back toward the land of plenty from whence we had come, our route was marked by circling vultures in the sky and by the bodies of the dead who lay down in the trackless waste for the last time. The ivory had been abandoned tusk by tusk as the blacks gave out, and along the trail of death was strewn the camp equipage and the horse trappings of 100 men. For some reason the Arab chief favored me to the last, possibly with the idea that of all his other treasures I could be most easily transported, for I was young and strong, and after the horses were killed I had walked and kept up with the best of the men. We English, you know, are great walkers, while these Arabians had never walked since they were old enough to ride a horse. I cannot tell you how much longer we kept on, but at last, with our strength almost gone, a handful of us reached the bottom of a deep gorge. To scale the opposite side was out of the question, and so we kept on down along the sands of what must have been the bed of an ancient river, until finally we came to a point where we looked out upon what appeared to be a beautiful valley in which we felt assured that we would find game in plenty. By then there were only two of us left, the chief and myself. I do not need to tell you what the valley was, for you found it in much the same way as I did. So quickly were we captured that it seemed they must have been waiting for us, and I learned later that such was the case, just as they were waiting for you. As you came through the forest, you must have seen the monkeys and parrots, and since you have entered the palace, how constantly these animals and the lions are used in the decorations. At home we were all familiar with talking parrots who repeated the things that they were taught to say. But these parrots are different in that they all talk in the same language that the people of the city use, and they say that the monkeys talk to the parrots, and the parrots fly to the city and tell the people what the monkeys say. And although it is hard to believe, I have learned that this is so, for I have lived here among them for 60 years in the palace of their king. They brought me, as they brought you, directly to the palace. The Arabian chief was taken elsewhere. I never knew what became of him. Ago the 25th was king then. I have seen many kings since that day. He was a terrible man, but then they are all terrible. "What is the matter with them?" asked the girl. "They are a race of maniacs," replied the old woman. "Had you not guessed it? Among them are excellent craftsmen and good farmers, and a certain amount of law and order, such as it is. They reverence all birds, but the parrot is their chief deity. There is one who is held here in the palace in a very beautiful apartment. He is their god of gods. He is a very old bird. If what Ago told me when I came is true, he must be nearly 300 years old by now. Their religious rites are revolting in the extreme, and I believe that it may be the practice of these rites through ages that has brought the race to its present condition of imbecility. And yet, as I said, they are not without some redeeming qualities. If legend may be credited, their forebears, a little handful of men and women who came from somewhere out of the north and became lost in the wilderness of Central Africa, found here only a barren desert valley. To my own knowledge, rain seldom if ever falls here, and yet you have seen a great forest and luxuriant vegetation outside of the city as well as within. This miracle is accomplished by the utilization of natural springs which their ancestors developed, and upon which they have improved to such an extent that the entire valley receives an adequate amount of moisture at all times. Ago told me that many generations before his time the forest was irrigated by changing the course of the streams which carried the spring water to the city, but that when the trees had sent their roots down to the natural moisture of the soil and required no further irrigation, the course of the stream was changed and other trees were planted, and so the forest grew until today it covers almost the entire floor of the valley, except for the open space where the city stands. I do not know that this is true. It may be that the forest has always been here, but it is one of their legends, and it is borne out by the fact that there is not sufficient rainfall here to support vegetation. They are peculiar people in many respects, not only in their form of worship and religious rites, but also in that they breed lions as other people breed cattle. You have seen how they use some of these lions, but the majority of them they fatten and eat. At first I imagined they ate lion meat as a part of their religious ceremony, but after many generations they came to crave it, so that now it is practically the only flesh they eat. They would, of course, rather die than eat the flesh of a bird, nor will they eat monkey's meat, while the herbivorous animals they raise only for milk, hides, and flesh for the lions. Upon the south side of the city are the corrals and pastures where the herbivorous animals are raised. Boar, deer, and antelope are used principally for the lions, while goats are kept for milk for the human inhabitants of the city. "And you have lived here all these years?" exclaimed the girl, "without ever seeing one of your own kind?" The old woman nodded affirmatively. "For 60 years you have lived here," continued Bertha Kircher, "and they have not harmed you." "I did not say they had not harmed me," said the old woman. "They did not kill me, that is all." "What?" The girl hesitated. "What," she continued at last, "was your position among them? Pardon me," she added quickly. "I think I know, but I should like to hear from your own lips, for whatever your position was, mine will doubtless be the same." The old woman nodded. "Yes," she said, "doubtless, if they can keep you away from the women." "What do you mean?" asked the girl. "For 60 years I have never been allowed near a woman. They would kill me even now if they could reach me. The men are frightful, God knows they are frightful. But heaven keep you from the women." "You mean," asked the girl, "that the men will not harm me?" "Ago the 25th made me his queen," said the old woman. "But he had many other queens, nor were they all human. He was not murdered for 10 years after I came here. Then the next king took me, and so it has been always. I am the oldest queen now. Very few of their women live to a great age. Not only are they constantly liable to assassination, but owing to their subnormal mentalities they are subject to periods of depression during which they are very likely to destroy themselves." She turned suddenly and pointed to the barred windows. "You see this room," she said, "with the black eunuch outside? Wherever you see these, you will know that there are women, for with very few exceptions they are never allowed out of captivity. They are considered and really are more violent than the men." For several minutes the two sat in silence, and then the younger woman turned to the older. "Is there no way to escape?" she asked. The old woman pointed again to the barred windows and then to the door, saying, "And there is the armed eunuch, and if you should pass him, how could you reach the street? And if you reached the street, how could you pass through the city to the outer wall? And even if, by some miracle, you should gain the outer wall, and by another miracle you should be permitted to pass through the gate, could you ever hope to traverse the forest where the great black lions roam and feed upon men? No," she exclaimed, answering her own question. "There is no escape, for after one had escaped from the palace and the city and the forest, it would be but to invite death in the frightful desert land beyond. In 60 years you are the first to find this buried city. In 1,000 no denizen of this valley has ever left it, and within the memory of man, or even in their legends, none had found them prior to my coming, other than a single warlike giant, the story of whom has been handed down from father to son. I think from the description that he must have been a Spaniard, a giant of a man in buckler and helmet, who fought his way through the terrible forest to the city gate, who fell upon those who were sent out to capture him, and slew him with his mighty sword. And when he had eaten of the vegetables from the gardens, and the fruit from the trees, and drank of the water from the stream, he turned about and fought his way back through the forest to the mouth of the gorge. But though he escaped the city and the forest, he did not escape the desert. For a legend runs that the king, fearful that he would bring others to attack him, sent a party after him to slay him. For 3 weeks they did not find him, for they went in the wrong direction, but at last they came upon his bones, picked clean by the vultures, lying a day's march up the same gorge through which you and I entered the valley. I do not know," continued the old woman, "that this is true. It is just one of their many legends." "Yes," said the girl, "it is true. I am sure it is true, for I have seen the skeleton and the corroded armor of this great giant." At this juncture the door was thrown open without ceremony, and a negro entered bearing 2 flat vessels in which were several smaller ones. These he set down on one of the tables near the women, and without a word turned and left. With the entrance of the man with the vessels, a delightful odor of cooked food had aroused the realization in the girl's mind that she was very hungry, and at a word from the old woman she walked to the table to examine the viands. The larger vessels which contained the smaller ones were of pottery, while those within them were quite evidently of hammered gold. To her intense surprise she found, lying between the smaller vessels, a spoon and a fork, which, while of quaint design, were quite as serviceable as any she had seen in more civilized communities. The tines of the fork were quite evidently of iron or steel, the girl did not know which, while the handle and the spoon were of the same material as the smaller vessels. There was a highly seasoned stew with meat and vegetables, a dish of fresh fruit, and a bowl of milk, beside which was a little jug containing something which resembled marmalade. So ravenous was she that she did not even wait for her companion to reach the table, and as she ate she could have sworn that never before had she tasted more palatable food. The old woman came slowly and sat down on one of the benches opposite her. As she removed the smaller vessels from the larger and arranged them before her on the table, a crooked smile twisted her lips as she watched the younger woman eat. "Hunger is a great leveler," she said with a laugh. "What do you mean?" asked the girl. "I venture to say that a few weeks ago you would have been nauseated at the idea of eating cat." "Cat!" exclaimed the girl. "Yes," said the old woman. "What is the difference? A lion is a cat." "You mean I am eating lion now?" "Yes," said the old woman, "and as they prepare it, it is very palatable. You will grow very fond of it." Bertha Kircher smiled a trifle dubiously. "I could not tell it," she said, "from lamb or veal." "No," said the woman, "it tastes as good to me, but these lions are very carefully kept and very carefully fed, and their flesh is so seasoned and prepared that it might be anything so far as taste is concerned." And so Bertha Kircher broke her long fast upon strange fruits, lion meat, and goat's milk. Scarcely had she finished when again the door opened and there entered a yellow-coated soldier. He spoke to the old woman. "The king," she said, "has commanded that you be prepared and brought to him. You are to share these apartments with me. The king knows that I am not like his other women. He never would have dared to put you with them. Herog the 16th has occasional lucid intervals. You must have been brought to him during one of these. Like the rest of them, he thinks that he alone of all the community is sane. But more than once I have thought that the various men with whom I have come in contact here, including the kings themselves, looked upon me as, at least, less mad than the others. Yet how I have retained my senses all these years is beyond me." "What do you mean by prepare?" asked Bertha Kircher. "You said that the king had commanded I be prepared and brought to him." "You will be bathed and furnished with a robe similar to that which I wear." "Is there no escape?" asked the girl. "Is there no way even in which I can kill myself?" The woman handed her the fork. "This is the only way," she said, "and you will notice that the tines are very short and blunt." The girl shuddered, and the old woman laid a hand gently upon her shoulder. "He may only look at you and send you away," she said. "Ago the 25th sent for me once, tried to talk with me, discovered that I could not understand him and that he could not understand me, ordered that I be taught the language of his people, and then apparently forgot me for a year. Sometimes I do not see the king for a long period. There was one king who ruled for 5 years whom I never saw. There is always hope. Even I, whose very memory has doubtless been forgotten, beyond these palace walls, still hope, though none knows better how futilely. The old woman led Bertha Kircher to an adjoining apartment in the floor of which was a pool of water. Here the girl bathed, and afterward her companion brought her one of the clinging garments of the native women and adjusted it about her figure. The material of the robe was of a gauzy fabric, which accentuated the rounded beauty of the girlish form. "There," said the old woman, as she gave a final pat to one of the folds of the garment. "You are a queen indeed." The girl looked down at her naked breasts and but half-concealed limbs in horror. "They are going to lead me into the presence of men in this half-nude condition," she exclaimed. The old woman smiled her crooked smile. "It is nothing," she said. "You will become accustomed to it as I did, who was brought up in the home of a minister of the gospel, where it was considered little short of a crime for a woman to expose her stockinged ankle. By comparison with what you will doubtless see, and the things that you may be called upon to undergo, this is but a trifle." For what seemed hours to the distraught girl, she paced the floor of her apartment, awaiting the final summons to the presence of the mad king. Darkness had fallen, and the oil flares within the palace had been lighted long before two messengers appeared with instructions that Herog demanded her immediate presence, and that the old woman, whom they called Xanila, was to accompany her. The girl felt some slight relief when she discovered that she was to have at least one friend with her, however powerless to assist her the old woman might be. The messengers conducted the two to a small apartment on the floor below. Xanila explained that this was one of the anterooms off the main throne room in which the king was accustomed to hold court with his entire retinue. A number of yellow-tunicked warriors sat about upon the benches within the room. For the most part their eyes were bent upon the floor, and their attitudes that of moody dejection. As the two women entered, several glanced indifferently at them, but for the most part no attention was paid to them. While they were waiting in the anteroom, there entered from another apartment a young man uniformed similarly to the others, with the exception that upon his head was a fillet of gold, in the front of which a single parrot feather rose erectly above his forehead. As he entered, the other soldiers in the room rose to their feet. "That is Metak, one of the king's sons," Xanila whispered to the girl. The prince was crossing the room toward the audience chamber when his glance happened to fall upon Bertha Kircher. He halted in his tracks and stood looking at her for a full minute without speaking. The girl, embarrassed by his bold stare and her scant attire, flushed, and dropping her gaze to the floor, turned away. Metak suddenly commenced to tremble from head to foot, and then, without warning other than a loud, hoarse scream, he sprang forward and seized the girl in his arms. Instantly pandemonium ensued. The two messengers who had been charged with the duty of conducting the girl to the king's presence danced shrieking about the prince, waving their arms and gesticulating wildly as though they would force him to relinquish her, the while they dared not lay hands upon royalty. The other guardsmen, as though suffering in sympathy with the madness of their prince, ran forward screaming and brandishing their sabers. The girl fought to release herself from the horrid embrace of the maniac, but with his left arm about her he held her as easily as though she had been but a babe, while with his free hand he drew his saber and struck viciously at those nearest him. One of the messengers was the first to feel the keen edge of Metak's blade. With a single fierce cut the prince drove through the fellow's collarbone and downward to the center of his chest. With a shrill shriek that rose above the screaming of the other guardsmen, the man dropped to the floor, and as the blood gushed from the frightful wound he struggled to rise once more to his feet, and then sank back again and died in a great pool of his own blood. In the meantime, Metak, still clinging desperately to the girl, had backed toward the opposite door. At the sight of the blood, two of the guardsmen, as though suddenly aroused to maniacal frenzy, dropped their sabers to the floor and fell upon each other with nails and teeth, while some sought to reach the prince and some to defend him. In a corner of the room sat one of the guardsmen, laughing uproariously, and just as Metak succeeded in reaching the door and taking the girl through, she thought that she saw another of the men spring upon the corpse of the dead messenger and bury his teeth in its flesh. During the orgy of madness, Xanila had kept closely at the girl's side, but at the door of the room Metak had seen her, and wheeling suddenly, cut viciously at her. Fortunately for Xanila, she was halfway through the door at the time, so that Metak's blade but dented itself upon the stone arch of the portal, and then Xanila, guided doubtless by the wisdom of 60 years of similar experiences, fled down the corridor as fast as her old and tottering legs would carry her. Metak, once outside the door, returned his saber to its scabbard, and lifting the girl bodily from the ground, carried her off in the opposite direction from that taken by Xanila. End of Chapter 19. The Queen's Story. Recording by Pamela Krantz.
Chapter 20 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 20. Came Tarzan. Just before dark that evening, an almost exhausted flyer entered the headquarters of Colonel Capell of the 2nd Rhodesians, and saluted. "Well, Thompson," asked the superior, "what luck? The others have all returned. Never saw a thing of Oldwick or his plane. I guess we shall have to give it up, unless you were more successful." "I was," replied the young officer. "I found the plane." "No!" ejaculated Colonel Capell. "Where is it? Any sign of Oldwick?" "It is in the rottenest hole in the ground you ever saw, quite a bit inland. Narrow gorge. Saw the plane all right, but can't reach it. There was a regular devil of a lion wandering around it. I landed near the edge of the cliff and was going to climb down and take a look at the plane, but this fellow hung around for an hour or more, and I finally had to give it up." "Do you think the lions got Oldwick?" asked the colonel. "I doubt it," replied Lieutenant Thompson. "From the fact that there was no indication that the lion had fed anywhere about the plane. I arose after I found it was impossible to get down around the plane and reconnoitered up and down the gorge. Several miles to the south I found a small wooded valley in the center of which, please don't think me crazy, sir, is a regular city. Streets, buildings, a central plaza with a lagoon, good-sized buildings with domes and minarets and all that sort of stuff." The elder officer looked at the younger compassionately. "You're all wrought up, Thompson," he said. "Go and take a good sleep. You have been on this job now for a long while, and it must have gotten on your nerves." The young man shook his head a bit irritably. "Pardon me, sir," he said, "but I am telling you the truth. I am not mistaken. I circled over the place several times. It may be that Oldwick has found his way there, or has been captured by these people." "Were there people in the city?" asked the colonel. "Yes, I saw them in the streets." "Do you think cavalry could reach the valley?" asked the colonel. "No," replied Thompson. "The country is all cut up with these deep gorges. Even infantry would have a devil of a time of it, and there is absolutely no water that I could discover for at least a 2 days' march." It was at this juncture that a big Vauxhall drew up in front of the headquarters of the 2nd Rhodesians, and a moment later General Smuts alighted and entered. Colonel Capell arose from his chair and saluted his superior, and the young lieutenant saluted and stood at attention. "I was passing," said the general, "and I thought I would stop for a chat. By the way, how is the search for Lieutenant Smith Oldwick progressing? I see Thompson here, and I believe he was one of those detailed to the search." "Yes," said Capell, "he was. He is the last to come in. He found the lieutenant's ship, and then he repeated what Lieutenant Thompson had reported to him. The general sat down at the table with Colonel Capell, and together the two officers, with the assistance of the flyer, marked the approximate location of the city which Thompson had reported he'd discovered. "It's a mighty rough country," remarked Smuts, "but we can't leave a stone unturned until we have exhausted every resource to find that boy. We will send out a small force. A small one will be more likely to succeed than a large one. About 1 company, Colonel, or say 2, with sufficient motor lorries for transport of rations and water. Put a good man in command, and let him establish a base as far to the west as the motors can travel. You can leave 1 company there and send the other forward. I am inclined to believe you can establish your base within a day's march of the city, and if such is the case, the force you send ahead should have no trouble on the score of lack of water, as there certainly must be water in the valley where the city lies. Detail a couple of planes for reconnaissance and messenger service, so that the base can keep in touch at all times with the advance party. When can your force move out?" "We can load the lorries tonight," replied Capell, "and march about 1 o'clock tomorrow morning." "Good," said the general. "Keep me advised." And returning the other salutes, he departed. As Tarzan leaped for the vines, he realized that the lion was close upon him, and that his life depended upon the strength of the creepers clinging to the city walls. But to his intense relief he found the stems as large around as a man's arm, and the tendrils which had fastened themselves to the wall so firmly fixed that his weight upon the stem appeared to have no appreciable effect upon them. He heard Numa's baffled roar as the lion slipped downward, clawing futilely at the leafy creepers, and then with the agility of the apes who had reared him, Tarzan bounded nimbly aloft to the summit of the wall. A few feet below him was the flat roof of the adjoining building, and as he dropped to it his back was toward the niche, from which an embrasure looked out upon the gardens and the forest beyond, so that he did not see the figure crouching there in the dark shadow. But if he did not see, he was not long in ignorance of the fact that he was not alone, for scarcely had his feet touched the roof when a heavy body leaped upon him from behind, and brawny arms encircled him about the waist. Taken at a disadvantage and lifted from his feet, the ape-man was for the time being helpless. Whatever the creature was that had seized him, it apparently had a well-defined purpose in mind, for it walked directly toward the edge of the roof, so that it was soon apparent to Tarzan that he was to be hurled to the pavement below, a most efficacious manner of disposing of an intruder. That he would be either maimed or killed, the ape-man was confident, but he had no intention of permitting his assailant to carry out the plan. Tarzan's arms and legs were free, but he was in such a disadvantageous position that he could not use them to any good effect. His only hope lay in throwing the creature off its balance. To this end, Tarzan straightened his body and leaned as far back against his captor as he could, and then suddenly lunged forward. The result was as satisfactory as he could possibly have hoped. The great weight of the ape-man, thrown suddenly out from an erect position, caused the other also to lunge violently forward, with the result that to save himself, he involuntarily released his grasp. Cat-like in his movements, the ape-man had no sooner touched the roof than he was upon his feet again, facing his adversary, a man almost as large as himself, and armed with a saber, which he now whipped from its scabbard. Tarzan, however, had no mind to allow the use of this formidable weapon, and so he dove for the other's legs beneath the vicious cut that was directed at him from the side, and as a football player tackles an opposing runner, Tarzan tackled his antagonist, carrying him backwards several yards and throwing him heavily to the roof upon his back. No sooner had the man touched the roof than the ape-man was upon his chest. One brawny hand sought and found the sword wrist, and the other the throat of the yellow-tunicked guardsman. Until then the fellow had fought in silence, but just as Tarzan's fingers touched his throat, he emitted a single piercing shriek that the brown fingers cut off almost instantly. The The fellow struggled to escape the clutch of the naked creature upon his breast, but equally as well might he have fought to escape the talons of Numa, the lion. Gradually, his struggles lessened. His pinpoint eyes popped from their sockets, rolling horribly upward, while from his foam-flecked lips his swollen tongue protruded. As his struggles ceased, Tarzan arose, and placing a foot upon the carcass of his kill, was upon the point of screaming forth his victory cry, when the thought that the work before him required the utmost caution sealed his lips. Walking to the edge of the roof, he looked down into the narrow winding street below. At intervals, apparently at each street intersection, an oil flare sputtered dimly from brackets set in the walls a trifle higher than a man's head. For the most part, the winding alleys were in dense shadow, and even in the immediate vicinity of the flares, the illumination was far from brilliant. In the restricted area of his vision, he could see that there were still a few of these strange inhabitants moving about the narrow thoroughfares. To prosecute his search for the young officer and the girl, he must be able to move about the city as freely as possible. But to pass beneath one of the corner flares, naked as he was except for a loincloth, and in every other respect markedly different from the inhabitants of the city, would be but to court almost immediate discovery. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, and he cast about for some feasible plan of action, his eyes fell upon the corpse upon the roof near him, and immediately there occurred to him the possibility of disguising himself in the raiment of his conquered adversary. It required but a few moments for the ape-man to clothe himself in the tights, sandals, and parrot-emblazoned yellow tunic of the dead soldier. Around his waist he buckled the saber belt, but beneath the tunic he retained the hunting knife of his dead father. His other weapons he could not lightly discard, and so, in the hope that he might eventually recover them, carried them to the edge of the wall and dropped them among the foliage at its base. At the last moment he found it difficult to part with his rope, which, with his knife, was his most accustomed weapon, and one which he had used for the greatest length of time. He found that by removing the saber belt he could wind the rope around his waist beneath his tunic, and then replacing the belt, still retain it entirely concealed from chance observation. At last, satisfactorily disguised, and with even his shock of black hair adding to the verisimilitude of his likeness to the natives of the city, he sought for some means of reaching the street below. While he might have risked a drop from the eaves of the roof, he feared to do so lest he attract the attention of passers-by and probable discovery. The roofs of the buildings varied in height, but as the ceilings were all low, he found that he could easily travel along the rooftops, and this he did for some little distance, until he suddenly discovered just ahead of him several figures reclining upon the roof of a nearby building. He had noticed openings in each roof, evidently giving ingress to the apartments below, and now, his advance cut off by those ahead of him, he decided to risk the chance of reaching the street through the interior of one of the buildings. Approaching one of the openings, he leaned over the black hole and listened for sounds of life in the apartment below. Neither his ears nor his nose registered evidence of the presence of any living creature in the immediate vicinity. And so, without further hesitation, the ape-man lowered his body through the aperture and was about to drop when his foot came in contact with the rung of a ladder, which he immediately took advantage of to descend to the floor of the room below. Here all was almost total darkness until his eyes became accustomed to the interior, the darkness of which was slightly alleviated by the reflected light from a distant street flare, which shone intermittently through the narrow windows fronting the thoroughfare. Finally assured that the apartment was unoccupied, Tarzan sought for a stairway to the ground floor. This he found in a dark hallway upon which the room opened, a flight of narrow stone steps leading downward toward the street. Chance favored him so that he reached the shadows of the arcade without encountering any of the inmates of the house. Once on the street, he was not at a loss as to the direction in which he wished to go, for he had tracked the two Europeans practically to the gate, which he felt assured must have given them entry to the city. His keen sense of direction and location made it possible for him to judge with considerable accuracy the point within the city where he might hope to pick up the spoor of those whom he sought. The first need, however, was to discover a street paralleling the northern wall, along which he could make his way in the direction of the gate he had seen from the forest. Realizing that his greatest hope of success lay in the boldness of his operations, he moved off in the direction of the nearest street flare without making any other attempt at concealment than keeping in the shadows of the arcade, which he judged would draw no particular attention to him, in that he saw other pedestrians doing likewise. The few he passed gave him no heed, and he had almost reached the nearest intersection when he saw several men wearing yellow tunics identical to that which he had taken from his prisoner. They were coming directly toward him, and the ape-man saw that should he continue on, he would meet them directly at the intersection of the two streets in the full light of the flare. His first inclination was to go steadily on, for personally he had no objection to chancing a scrimmage with them, but a sudden recollection of the girl, possibly a helpless prisoner in the hands of these people, caused him to seek some other and less hazardous plan of action. He had almost emerged from the shadow of the arcade into the full light of the flare, and the approaching men were but a few yards from him, when he suddenly kneeled and pretended to adjust the wrappings of his sandals. Wrappings which, by the way, he was not at all sure that he had adjusted as their makers had intended them to be adjusted. He was still kneeling when the soldiers came abreast of him. Like the others he had passed, they paid no attention to him, and the moment they were behind him, he continued upon his way, turning to the right at the intersection of the two streets. The street he now took was, at this point, so extremely winding that, for the most part, it received no benefit from the flares at either corner, so that he was forced practically to grope his way in the dense shadows of the arcade. The street became a little straighter just before he reached the next flare. As he came within sight of it, he saw silhouetted against a patch of light the figure of a lion. The beast was coming slowly down the street in Tarzan's direction. A woman crossed the way directly in front of it, and the lion paid no attention to her, nor she to the lion. An instant later, a little child ran after the woman, and so close did he run before the lion that the beast was forced to turn out of its way a step to avoid colliding with the little one. The ape-man grinned and crossed quickly to the opposite side of the street, for his delicate senses indicated that at this point the breeze stirring through the city streets and deflected by the opposite wall would now blow from the lion toward him as the beast passed, whereas if he remained upon the side of the street upon which he had been walking when he discovered the carnivore, his scent would have been borne to the nostrils of the animal. And Tarzan was sufficiently jungle-wise to realize that while he might deceive the eyes of man and beast, he could not so easily disguise from the nostrils of one of the great cats that he was a creature of a different species from the inhabitants of the city, the only human beings possibly that Numa was familiar with. In him the cat would recognize a stranger and therefore an enemy, and Tarzan had no desire to be delayed by an encounter with a savage lion. His ruse worked successfully, the lion passing him with not more than a side glance in his direction. He had proceeded for some little distance and had about reached a point where he judged he would find the street which led up from the city gate, when, at an intersection of two streets, his nostrils caught the scent spore of the girl. Out of a maze of other scent spores, the ape-man picked the familiar odor of the girl, and a second later, that of Smith Oldwick. He had been forced to accomplish it, however, by bending very low at each street intersection in repeated attention to his sandal wrappings, bringing his nostrils as close to the pavement as possible. As he advanced along the street through which the two had been conducted earlier in the day, he noted, as had they, the change in the type of buildings as he passed from a residence district into that portion occupied by shops and bazaars. Here the number of flares was increased so that they appeared not only at street intersections but midway between as well, and there were many more people abroad. The shops were open and lighted, for with the setting of the sun the intense heat of the day had given place to a pleasant coolness. Here also the number of lions, roaming loose through the thoroughfares, increased, and also for the first time Tarzan noted the idiosyncrasies of the people. Once he was nearly upset by a naked man running rapidly through the street, screaming at the top of his voice. And again he nearly stumbled over a woman who was making her way in the shadows of one of the arcades upon all fours. At first the ape-man thought she was hunting for something she had dropped, but as he drew to one side to watch her, he saw that she was doing nothing of the kind, that she had merely elected to walk upon her hands and knees rather than erect upon her feet. In another block he saw two creatures struggling upon the roof of an adjacent building until finally one of them, wrenching himself free from the grasp of the other, gave his adversary a mighty push which hurled him to the pavement below, where he lay motionless upon the dusty road. For an instant a wild shriek re-echoed through the city from the lungs of the victor, and then, without an instant's hesitation, the fellow leaped head first to the street beside the body of his victim. A lion moved out from the dense shadows of a doorway and approached the two bloody and lifeless things before him. Tarzan wondered what effect the odor of blood would have upon the beast, and was surprised to see that the animal only sniffed at the corpses and the hot red blood, and then lay down beside the two dead men. He had passed the lion but a short distance when his attention was called to the figure of a man lowering himself laboriously from the roof of a building upon the east side of the thoroughfare. Tarzan's curiosity was aroused. End of chapter 20. Recording by Bill Mosley, Bernardo, Texas, USA.
Chapter 21 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Mason of Midland, Michigan. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 21. In the Alcove. As Smith Oldwick realized that he was alone and practically defenseless in an enclosure filled with great lions, he was, in his weakened condition, almost in a state verging on hysterical terror. Clinging to the grating for support, he dared not turn his head in the direction of the beast behind him. He felt his knees giving weakly beneath him. Something within his head spun rapidly around. He became very dizzy and nauseated, and then suddenly all went black before his eyes as his limp body collapsed at the foot of the grating. How long he lay there unconscious, he never knew. But as reason slowly reasserted itself in his semi-conscious state, he was aware that he lay in a cool bed upon the whitest of linen, in a bright and cheery room, and that upon one side close to him was an open window, the delicate hangings of which were fluttering in a soft summer breeze which blew in from sun-kissed orchard of ripening fruit which he could see without, an old orchard in which soft green grass grew between the laden trees, and where the sun filtered through the foliage, and upon the dappled greensward a little child was playing with a frolicsome puppy. God, thought the man, what a horrible nightmare I have passed through. And then he felt a hand stroking his brow and cheek, a cool and gentle hand that smoothed away his troubled recollections. For a long minute Smith Oldwick lay in utter peace and contentment, until gradually there was forced upon his sensibility the fact that the hand had become rough, and that it was no longer cool but hot and moist. and suddenly he opened his eyes and looked up into the face of a huge lion. Lieutenant Harold Percy Smith Oldwick was not only an English gentleman and an officer in name, he was also what these implied, a brave man. But when he realized that the sweet picture he had looked upon was but the figment of a dream, and that in reality he still lay where he had fallen at the foot of the grating, with a lion standing over him licking his face, the tears sprang into his eyes and ran down his cheeks. Never, he thought, had an unkind fate played so cruel a joke upon a human being. For some time he lay feigning death while the lion, having ceased to lick him, sniffed about his body. There are some things than which death is to be preferred, and there came at last to the Englishman the realization that it would be better to die swiftly than to lie in this horrible predicament until his mind broke beneath the strain and he went mad. And so, deliberately and without haste, he rose, clinging to the grating for support. At his first move the lion growled, but after that he paid no further attention to the man, and when at last Smith Oldwick had regained his feet, the lion moved indifferently away. Then it was that the man turned and looked about the enclosure. Sprawled beneath the shade of the trees and lying upon the long bench beside the south wall, the great beasts rested, with the exception of 2 or 3 who moved restlessly about. It was these that the man feared, and yet when 2 more of them had passed him by, he began to feel reassured, recalling the fact that they were accustomed to the presence of man. And yet he dared not move from the grating. As the man examined his surroundings, he noted that the branches of one of the trees near the further wall spread close beneath an open window. If he could reach that tree, and had strength to do so, he could easily climb out upon the branch and escape, at least from the enclosure of the lions. But in order to reach the tree, he must pass the full length of the enclosure, and at the very bole of the tree itself, 2 lions lay sprawled out in slumber. For a half an hour the man stood gazing longingly at the seeming avenue of escape, and at last, with a muttered oath, he straightened up, and throwing back his shoulders in a gesture of defiance, he walked slowly and deliberately down the center of the courtyard. One of the prowling lions turned from the side wall and moved toward the center, directly in the man's path. But Smith Oldwick was committed to what he considered his one chance for even temporary safety, and so he kept on, ignoring the presence of the beast. The lion slouched to the side and sniffed him, and then, growling, he bared his teeth. Smith Oldwick drew his pistol from his shirt. If he has made up his mind to kill me, he thought, I can't see that it will make any difference in the long run whether I infuriate him or not. The beggar can't kill me any deader in one mood than another. But with the man's movement in withdrawing the weapon from his shirt, the lion's attitude suddenly altered, and though he still growled, he turned and sprang away. And then, at last, the Englishman stood almost at the foot of the tree that was his goal, and between him and safety sprawled a sleeping lion. Above him was a limb that ordinarily he could have leapt for and reached with ease, but, weak from his wounds and a loss of blood, he doubted his ability to do so now. There was even a question as to whether he would be able to ascend the tree at all. There was just one chance. The lowest branch left the bole within easy reach of a man standing on the ground close to the tree's stem. But to reach a position where the branch would be accessible, he must step over the body of a lion. Taking a deep breath, he placed one foot between the sprawled legs of the beast and gingerly raised the other to plant it upon the opposite side of the tawny body. What, he thought, if the beggar should happen to wake now? The suggestion sent a shudder through his frame, but he did not hesitate or withdraw his foot. Gingerly he planted it beyond the lion, threw his weight forward upon it, and cautiously brought his other foot to the side of the first. He had passed, and the lion had not awakened. Smith Oldwick was weak from loss of blood and the hardships he had undergone, but the realization of his situation impelled him to a show of agility and energy, which he probably could scarcely have equaled when in possession of his normal strength. With his life depending on the success of his efforts, he swung himself quickly to the lower branches of the tree and scrambled upward out of the reach of possible harm from the lions below. Though the sudden movement in the branches above them awakened both the sleeping beasts, the animals raised their heads and looked questioningly up for a moment, and then lay back again to resume their broken slumber. So easily had the Englishman succeeded thus far that he suddenly began to question as to whether he had at any time been in real danger. The lions, as he knew, were accustomed to the presence of men, but yet they were still lions, and he was free to admit that he breathed more easily now he was safe above their clutches. Before him lay the open window he had seen from the ground. He was now on a level with it, and could see an apparently unoccupied chamber beyond, and towards this he made his way along a stout branch that swung beneath the opening. It was not a difficult feat to reach the window, and a moment later he drew himself over the sill and dropped into the room. He found himself in a rather spacious apartment, the floor of which was covered with rugs of barbaric design, while the few pieces of furniture were of similar type to that which he had seen in the room on the first floor into which he and Bertha Kircher had been ushered at the conclusion of their journey. At one end of the room was what appeared to be a curtained alcove, the heavy hangings of which completely hid the interior. In the wall opposite the window and near the alcove was a closed door, apparently the only exit from the room. He could see, in the waning light without, that the close of the day was fast approaching, and he hesitated while he deliberated the advisability of waiting until darkness had fallen, or of immediately searching for some means of escape from the building and the city. He at last decided that it would do no harm to investigate beyond the room, that he might have some idea as how best to plan his escape after dark. To this end, he crossed the room towards the door, but he had only taken a few steps when the hangings before the alcove separated and the figure of a woman appeared in the opening. She was young and beautifully formed. The single drapery wound around her body from below her breasts left no detail of her symmetrical proportions unrevealed. But her face was the face of an imbecile. At sight of her, Smith Oldwick halted, momentarily expecting that his presence would elicit screams for help from her. On the contrary, she came toward him smiling, and when she was close, her slender, shapely fingers touched the sleeve of his torn blouse as a curious child might handle a new toy. And still with the same smile, she examined him from head to foot, taking in childish wonderment, every detail of his apparel. Presently, she spoke to him in a soft, well-modulated voice, which contrasted sharply with her facial appearance. The voice and the girlish figure harmonized perfectly and seemed to belong to each other, while the head and face were those of another creature. Smith Oldwick could understand no word of what she said, but nevertheless he spoke to her in his own cultured tone, the effect of which upon her was evidently most gratifying, for before he realized her intentions or could prevent her, she had thrown both arms around his neck and was kissing him with the utmost abandon. The man tried to free himself from the rather surprising attentions, but she only clung more tightly to him, and suddenly, as he recalled that he had always heard that one must humor the mentally deficient, and at the same time seeing in her a possible agency of escape, he dosed his eyes and returned her embraces. It was at this juncture that the door opened and a man entered. With the sound from the first movement of the latch, Smith Oldwick opened his eyes, but though he endeavored to disengage himself from the girl, he realized that the newcomer had seen their rather compromising position. The girl, whose back was towards the door, seemed at first not to realize that someone had entered, but when she did, she turned quickly, and as her eyes fell upon the man whose terrible face was now distorted with an expression of hideous rage, she turned, screaming, and fled towards the alcove. The Englishman, flushed and embarrassed, stood there where she had left him. With the sudden realization of the futility of attempting an explanation came that of the menacing appearance of the man, whom he now recognized as the official who had received them in the room below. The fellow's face, livid with insane rage and, possibly, jealousy, was twitching violently, accentuating the maniacal expression that he habitually wore. For a moment he seemed paralyzed by anger, and then, with a loud shriek that rose into an uncanny wail, he drew his curved saber and sprang toward the Englishman. To Smith Oldwick there seemed no possible hope of escaping the keen-edged weapon in the hands of the infuriated man. and though he felt assured that it would draw down upon him with an equally sudden and possibly more terrible death, he did the only thing that remained for him to do, drew his pistol and fired straight for the heart of the oncoming man. Without even so much as a groan, the fellow lunged forward upon the floor at Smith Oldwick's feet, killed instantly with a bullet through the heart. For several seconds the silence of the tomb reigned in the apartment. The Englishman, standing over the prostrate figure of the dead man, watched the door with drawn weapon, expecting momentarily to hear the rush of feet of those to whom he was sure would immediately investigate the report of the pistol. But no sounds came from below to indicate that anyone there had heard the explosion, and presently the man's attention was distracted from the door to the alcove, between the hangings of which the face of the girl appeared, the eyes of which were widely dilated, and the lower jaw dropped in an expression of surprise and awe. The girl's gaze was riveted upon the figure upon the floor, and presently she crept stealthily into the room and tiptoed towards the corpse. She appeared as though constantly poised for flight, and when she had come to within 2 or 3 feet of the body, she stopped and, looking up at Smith Oldwick, voiced some interrogation which he could not, of course, understand. Then she came close to the side of the dead man, and kneeling upon the floor, felt gingerly of the body. Presently she shook the corpse by the shoulder, and then, with a show of strength which her tenderly girlish form belied, she turned the body over on its back. If she had been in doubt before, one glance at the hideous features set in death must have convinced her that life was extinct, and with the realization there broke from her lips the peal after peal of mad, maniacal laughter, as with her little hands she beat upon the upturned face and breast of the dead man. It was a gruesome sight, from which the Englishman involuntarily drew back, a gruesome, disgusting sight, as he realized might never be witnessed outside a madhouse or this frightful city. In the midst of her frenzied rejoicing at the death of the man, and Smith Oldwick could attribute her actions to no other cause, she suddenly desisted from her futile attacks upon the insensate flesh, and, leaping to her feet, ran quickly to the door, where she shot a wooden bolt into the socket, thus securing them from interference from without. Then she returned to the center of the room and spoke rapidly to the Englishman, gesturing occasionally toward the body of the slain man. When he could not understand, she presently became provoked, and in a sudden hysteria of madness she rushed forward as though to strike the Englishman. Smith Oldwick dropped back a few steps and leveled his pistol upon her. Mad though she must have been, she evidently was not so mad but what she had connected the loud report, the diminutive weapon, and the sudden death of the man in whose house she dwelt, for she instantly desisted, and quite as suddenly as it had come upon her, her homicidal mood departed. Again the vacuous imbecile smile took possession of her features, and her voice, dropping its harshness, resumed the soft, well-modulated tones with which she had first addressed him. Now she attempted by signs to indicate her wishes, and, motioning Smith Oldwick to follow her, she went to the hangings and, opening them, disclosed the alcove. It was rather more than an alcove, being a fair-sized room, heavy with rugs and hangings and soft, pillowed couches. Turning at the entrance, she pointed to the corpse upon the floor of the outer room, and then, crossing the alcove, she raised some draperies which covered a couch and fell to the floor upon all sides, disclosing an opening beneath the furniture. To this opening she pointed, and then again to the corpse, indicating plainly to the Englishman that it was her desire that the body be hidden here. But if he had been in doubt, she essayed to dispel it by grasping his sleeve and urging him in the direction of the body, which the two of them then lifted and half carried and half dragged into the alcove. At first they encountered some difficulty when they endeavored to force the body of the man into the small space she had selected for it, but eventually they succeeded in doing so. Smith Oldwick was again impressed by the fiendish brutality of the girl. In the center of the room lay a blood-stained rug, which the girl quickly gathered up and draped over a piece of furniture in such a way that the stain was hidden. By rearranging the other rugs and by bringing one from the alcove, she restored the room to order so no outward indication of the tragedy so recently enacted there was apparent. These things attended to, and the hangings draped once more about the couch that they might hide the gruesome thing beneath, the girl once more threw her arms about the Englishman's neck and dragged him toward the soft and luxurious pillows above the dead man. Acutely conscious of the horror of his position, filled with loathing, disgust, and outraged sense of decency, Smith Oldwick was so acutely alive to the demands of self-preservation, he felt that he was warranted in buying his life at almost any price, but there was a point at which his finer nature rebelled. It was at this juncture that a loud knock sounded upon the door of the outer room. Springing from the couch, the girl seized the man by the arm and dragged him after her to the wall close by the head of the couch. Here she drew back one of the hangings, revealing a little niche behind, into which she shoved the Englishman, and dropped the hangings before him, effectually hiding him from the observation from the rooms beyond. He heard her cross the alcove to the door of the outer room, and heard the bolt withdrawn, followed by the voice of a man mingled with that of the girl. The tones of both seemed rational, so that he might have been listening to an ordinary conversation in some foreign tongue. Yet, with the gruesome experiences of the day behind him, he could not but momentarily expect some insane outbreak from beyond the hangings. He was aware from the sounds that the two had entered the alcove, and, prompted by the desire to know what manner of man he might next have to contend with, he slightly parted the heavy folds that hid the two from view, and looking out he saw them sitting on the couch with their arms about each other, the girl with the same expressionless smile upon her face that she had vouchsafed him. He found that he could so arrange the hangings that the very narrow slit between the two of them permitted him to watch the actions of those in the alcove without revealing himself or increasing his liability of detection. He saw the girl lavishing her kisses upon the newcomer, a much younger man than he whom Smith Oldwick had dispatched. Presently the girl disengaged herself from the embrace of her lover as though struck by a sudden memory. Her brows puckered as in labored thought, and then, with a startled expression, she threw a glance backward toward the hidden niche where the Englishman stood, after which she whispered rapidly to her companion, occasionally jerking her head in the direction of the niche, and on several occasions making a move with one hand and forefinger, which Smith Oldwick could not mistake as other than an attempt to describe his pistol and its use. It was evident then to him that she was betraying him, and without further loss of time he turned his back toward the hangings and commenced a rapid examination of his hiding place. In the alcove the man and the girl whispered, and then cautiously and with great stealth the man rose and drew his curved saber. On tiptoe he approached the hangings, the girl creeping at his side. Neither spoke now, nor was there any sound in the room as the girl sprang forward, and with outstretched arm and pointing finger indicated a point upon the curtain at the height of the man's breast. Then she stepped to one side, and her companion, raising his blade to a horizontal position, lunged suddenly forward, and with the full weight of his body and his right arm, drove the sharp point through the hangings and into the niche behind for its full length. Bertha Kircher, finding her struggles futile and realizing that she must conserve her strength for some chance opportunity of escape, desisted from her efforts to break from the grasp of Prince Metak, as the fellow fled with her through the dimly lighted corridors of the palace. Through many chambers the prince fled, bearing his prize. It was evidence to the girl that, though her captor was the king's son, he was not above capture and punishment for his deeds, as otherwise he would not have shown such evident anxiety to escape with her, as well as from the results of his act. From the fact that he was constantly turning affrighted eyes behind them, and glancing suspiciously into every nook and corner that they passed, she guessed that the prince's punishment might be both speedy and terrible were they caught. She knew from their route that they must have doubled back several times, although she had quite lost all sense of direction. But she did not know that the prince was as equally confused as she, and that really he was running in an aimless, erratic manner, hoping that he might stumble eventually upon a place of refuge. Nor is it to be wondered at that this offspring of maniacs should have difficulty in orienting himself in the winding mazes of a palace designed by maniacs for a maniac king. Now, a corridor turned gradually and almost imperceptibly in a new direction. Again, one doubled back upon and crossed itself. Here the floor rose gradually to the level of another story, or again there might be a spiral stairway down which the mad prince rushed dizzily with his burden. Upon what floor they were in, or what part of the palace even, Maytak had no idea until, halting abruptly at a closed door, he pushed it open to step into a brilliantly lighted chamber filled with warriors, at one end of which sat the king upon a great throne. Beside this, to the girl's surprise, she saw another throne, where seated a huge lioness. Recalling to her the words of Senelia, which, at the time, had made no impression on her, but he had many other queens, nor were they all human. At the sight of Maytak and the girl, the king rose from his throne and started across the chamber, all semblance of royalty vanishing in the maniac's uncontrollable passion. And as he came, he shrieked orders and commands at the top of his voice. No sooner had Maytak so unwarily opened the door to this hornet's nest than he immediately withdrew and, turning, fled again in a new direction. But now 100 men were close upon his heels, laughing, shrieking, and possibly cursing. He dodged hither and thither, distancing them for several minutes until, at the bottom of a long runway that inclined steeply downward from a higher level, he burst into a subterranean apartment lighted by many flares. In the center of the room was a pool of considerable size, the level of water being but a few inches below the floor. Those behind the fleeing prince and his captive entered the chamber in time to see Maytak leap into the water with the girl and disappear beneath the surface, taking his captive with him. Nor, though they waited excitedly around the rim of the pool, did either of the two again emerge. When Smith Oldwig turned to investigate his hiding place, his hands, groping upon the rear wall, immediately came in contact with the wooden panels of a door and a bolt such as that which secured the door of the outer room. Cautiously and silently drawing the wooden bar, he pushed gently against the panel to find that the door swung easily and noiselessly outward into utter darkness. Moving carefully and feeling forward for each step, he passed out of the niche, closing the door behind him. Peering about, he discovered that he was in a narrow corridor, which he followed cautiously for a few yards to be brought up suddenly by what appeared to be a ladder across a passageway. He felt of the obstruction carefully with his hands until he was assured that it was indeed a ladder and that a solid wall was just beyond it, ending the corridor. Therefore, as he could not go forward, and as the ladder ended at the floor upon which he stood, and as he did not care to retrace his steps, there was no alternative but to climb upward, and this he did, his pistol ready in his side pocket of his blouse. He had ascended but 2 or 3 rungs when his head came suddenly and painfully in contact with a hard surface above him. Groping about with one hand over his head, he discovered that the obstacle seemed to be the covering to a trapdoor in the ceiling, which, with a little effort, he succeeded in raising a couple of inches, revealing through the cracks the stars of a clear African night. With a sigh of relief, but with unabated caution, he gently slid the trapdoor to one side, far enough to permit him to raise his eyes above the level of the roof. A quick glance assured him that there was none near enough to observe his movements, nor, in fact, as far as he could see, was anyone in sight. Drawing himself quickly through the aperture, he replaced the cover and endeavored to regain his bearings. Directly to the south of him, the low roof he stood upon adjoined a much loftier portion of the building, which rose several stories above his head. A few yards to the west, he could see the flickering light of the flares of a winding street, and towards this he made his way. From the edge of the roof, he looked down upon the nightlife of the mad city. He saw men and women and children and lions, and of all that he saw, it was quite evident to him that only the lions were sane. With the aid of the stars, he easily picked out the points of the compass, and following carefully in his memory the steps that had led him into the city and to the roof upon which he now stood, He knew that the thoroughfare upon which he looked was the same along which he and Bertha Kircher had been led as prisoners earlier in the day. If he could but reach this, he might be able to pass undetected in the shadows of the arcade to the city gate. He had already given up as futile the thought of seeking out the girl and attempting to succor her, for he knew that alone, and with the few remaining rounds of ammunition he possessed, he could do nothing against this city full of armed men. That he could live to cross the lion-infested forest beyond the city was doubtful, and having, by some miracle, won to the desert beyond, his fate would be certainly sealed. But yet he was consumed with but one desire, to leave behind him, as far as possible, this horrid city of maniacs. He saw that the roofs rose to the same level as that upon which he stood unbroken to the north to the next street intersection. Directly below him was a flare. To reach the pavement in safety, it was necessary that he find as dark a portion of the avenue as possible, and so he sought along the edge of the roofs for a place where he might descend in comparative concealment. He had proceeded some little way beyond a point where the street curved abruptly to the east before he discovered a location sufficiently to his liking. But even here he was compelled to wait a considerable time for a satisfactory moment for his descent, which he had decided to make down one of the pillars of the arcade. Each time he prepared to lower himself over the edge of the roofs, footsteps approaching in one direction or another deterred him, until at last he had almost come to the conclusion that he would have to wait for the entire city to sleep before continuing his flight. But finally came a moment which he felt propitious, and, though with inward qualms, it was with outward calm that he commenced the descent to the street below. When at last he stood beneath the arcade, he was congratulating himself upon the success that had attended his efforts up to this point when, at a slight sound behind him, he turned to see a tall figure in the yellow tunic of a warrior confronting him. End of Chapter 21. Recording by Dan Mason of Midland, Michigan. Chapter 22 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Mason. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 22. Out of the Niche. Numa the lion growled futilely in baffled rage as he slipped back to the ground at the foot of the wall after his unsuccessful attempt to drag down the fleeing ape-man. He poised to make a second effort to follow the escaping quarry when his nose picked up a hitherto unnoticed quality in the scent spoor of his intended prey. Sniffing at the ground that Tarzan's feet had barely touched, Numa's growl changed to a low whine, for he had recognized the scent spoor of the man-thing that had rescued him from the pit of the Wamabos. What thoughts passed through that massive head? Who may say? But now there was no indication of baffled rage as the great lion turned and moved majestically eastward along the wall. At the eastern end of the city, he turned towards the south, continuing his way to the south side of the wall, along which there were pens and corrals where the herbivorous flocks were fattened for the herds of domesticated lions within the city. The great black lions of the forest fed with almost equal impartiality upon the flesh of the grass eaters and man. Like Numa of the pit, they occasionally made excursions across the desert to the fertile valley of the Wamabos, but principally they took their toll of meat from the herds of the walled city of Herog, the Mad King, or seized upon some of his luckless subjects. Numa of the pit was in some respects an exception to the rule which guided his fellows of the forest, in that as a cub he had been trapped and carried into the city, where he was kept for breeding purposes, only to escape in his second year. They had tried to teach him in the city of Maniacs that he must not eat the flesh of man, and the result of their schooling was that only when aroused to anger, or upon that one occasion that he had been impaled by the pangs of hunger, did he ever attack man. The animal corrals of the Maniacs are protected by an outer wall or palisade of upright logs, the lower ends of which are embedded in the ground, the logs themselves being placed as close together as possible and further reinforced and bound together by withes. At intervals, there are gates through which the flocks are turned on to the grazing land south of the city during the daytime. It is at such times that the black lions of the forest take their greatest toll from the herds, and it is infrequent that a lion attempts to enter the corrals at night. But Numa of the Pit, having scented the spoor of his benefactor, was minded again to pass into the walled city, and with that idea in his cunning brain, he crept stealthily along the outer side of the palisade, testing each gateway with a padded foot until at last he discovered one which seemed insecurely fastened. Lowering his great head, he pressed against the gate, surging forward with all the weight of his huge body and the strength of his giant sinews. One mighty effort, and Numa was within the corral. The enclosure contained a herd of goats, which immediately upon the advent of the carnivore started a mad stampede to the opposite end of the corral, which was bounded by the south wall of the city. Numa had been within such a corral as this before, so he knew that somewhere in the wall was a small door through which the goat herder might pass from the city to his flock. Toward this door he made his way, whether by plan or accident it is difficult to say, though in the light of ensuing events it seems possible that the former was the case. To reach the gate he must pass directly through the herd, which had huddled affrightedly close to the opening, so that once again there was a furious rush of hoofs as Numa strode quickly to the side of the portal. If Numa had planned, he had planned well, for scarcely had he reached his position when the door opened and a herder's head was projected into the enclosure, the fellow evidently seeking an explanation of the disturbance among his flock. Possibly he discovered the cause of the commotion, but it is doubtful, for it was dark, and the great taloned paw that reached up and struck downward a mighty blow that almost severed his head from his body moved so quickly and silently that the man was dead within a fraction of a second from the moment that he opened the door, and then Numa, knowing now his way, passed through the wall into the dimly lighted street of the city beyond. Smith Oldwick's first thought when he was accosted by the figure in the yellow tunic of a soldier was to shoot the man dead and trust to his legs in the dimly lighted winding streets to permit his escape, for he knew that to be accosted was equivalent to recapture, since no inhabitant of this weird city but would recognize him as an alien. It would be a simple thing to shoot the man from the pocket where the pistol lay without drawing the weapon, and with this purpose in mind the Englishman slipped his hand into the side pocket of his blouse. But simultaneously with this action his wrist was seized in a powerful grasp, and a low voice whispered in English, "Lieutenant, it is I, Tarzan of the Apes." The relief from the nervous strain under which he had been laboring for so long left Smith Oldwick suddenly as weak as a babe, so that he was forced to grasp the ape-man's arm for support. And when he found his voice, all he could do was repeat, "You? You? I thought you were dead." "No, not dead," replied Tarzan, "and I see that you are not either. But how about the girl?" "I haven't seen her either," replied the Englishman, "since we were brought here. We were taken into a building on the plaza close by, and there we were separated. She was led away by guards, and I was put into a den of lions. I haven't seen her since." "How did you escape?" asked the ape-man. "The lions didn't seem to pay much attention to me, and I climbed out of the place by way of a tree and through a window into a room on the second floor. Had a little scrimmage there with a fellow and was hidden by one of their women in a hole in the wall. The loony thing then betrayed me to another bounder who happened in, but I found a way out and up onto the roof, where I've been for quite some time now, waiting for a chance to get down into the street without being seen. That's all I know, but I haven't the slightest idea in the world where to look for Miss Kircher." "Where are you going now?" asked Tarzan. Smith Oldwick hesitated. Well, I couldn't do anything here alone, and I was going to try to get out of the city and in some way reach the British forces east and bring help." "You couldn't do it," said Tarzan. "Even if you got through the forest alive, you could never cross the desert country without food or water." "What shall we do then?" asked the Englishman. "We will see if we can find the girl," replied the ape-man. And then, as though he had forgotten the presence of the Englishman and was arguing to convince himself, "She may be a German and a spy, but she is a woman, a white woman. I can't leave her here." "But how are we going to find her?" asked the Englishman. "I have followed her this far," replied Tarzan, "and unless I am greatly mistaken, I can follow her still farther." "But I cannot accompany you in these clothes without exposing us both to detection and arrest," argued Smith Oldwick. "We will get you other clothes then," said Tarzan. "How?" asked the Englishman. "Go back to the roof beside the city wall where I entered," replied the ape man with a grim smile, "and ask the naked dead man there how I got my disguise." Smith Oldwick looked quickly up at his companion. "I have it," he exclaimed. "I know where there's a fellow who doesn't need his clothes anymore, and if we can get back on this roof I think we can find him and get his apparel without much resistance. Only a girl and a young fellow whom we could easily surprise and overcome." "What do you mean?" asked Tarzan. "How do you know that the man doesn't need his clothes anymore?" "I know he doesn't need them," replied the Englishman, "because I killed him." "Oh," exclaimed the ape man, "I see. I guess it might be easier that way than to tackle one of these fellows in the street where there's more chance of our being interrupted." "But how are we going to reach the roof again, after all?" queried Smith Oldwick. "The same way you came down," replied Tarzan. "This roof is low and there is a little ledge formed by the capital of each column. I noticed that when you descended. Some of the buildings wouldn't have been so easy to negotiate." Smith Oldwick looked up toward the eaves of the low roof. "It's not very high," he said, "but I'm afraid I can't make it. I'll try. I've been pretty weak since a lion mauled me and the guards beat me up, and too, I haven't eaten since yesterday." Tarzan thought a moment. "You've got to go with me," he said at last. "I can't leave you here. The only chance you have of escape is through me, and I can't go with you now until we've found the girl." "I want to go with you," replied Smith Oldwick. "I'm not much good now, but at that two of us may be better than one." "All right," said Tarzan, "come on." And before the Englishman realized what the other contemplated, Tarzan had picked him up and thrown him across his shoulder. "Now hang on," whispered the ape man, and with a short run he clambered ape-like up the front of the low arcade. So quickly and easily was it done that the Englishman scarcely had time to realize what was happening before he was deposited safely upon the roof. "There," remarked Tarzan. "Now lead me to the place you speak of." Smith Oldwick had no difficulty in locating the trap in the roof through which he had escaped. Removing the cover, the ape man bent low, listening and sniffing. "Come," he said after a moment's investigation, and lowered himself to the floor beneath. Smith Oldwick followed him, and together the two crept through the darkness towards the door in the back wall of the niche in which the Englishman had been hidden by the girl. They found the door ajar, and opening it, Tarzan saw a streak of light showing through the hangings that separated it from the alcove. Placing his eye close to the aperture, he saw the girl and the young man of which the Englishman had spoken, seated on opposite sides of a low table upon which food was spread. Serving them was a giant Negro, and it was he whom the ape man watched most closely. Familiar with the tribal idiosyncrasies of a great number of African tribes over a considerable portion of the Dark Continent, the Tarmangani at last felt reasonably assured that he knew from what part of Africa this slave had come, and the dialect of his people. There was, however, the chance that the fellow had been captured in childhood, and that through long years of non-use his native language had become lost to him. But then there was always had been an element of chance connected with nearly every event of Tarzan's life. So he waited patiently until in the performance of his duties the black man approached a little table which stood near to the niche in which Tarzan and the Englishman hid. As the slave bent over some dish which stood upon the table, his ear was not far from the aperture through which Tarzan looked, apparently from a solid wall, for the Negro had no knowledge of the existence of the niche. Came to him in the tongue of his own people the whispered words, "If you would return to the land of the Wamabo, say nothing, but do as I bid you." The black rolled terrified eyes towards the hanging at his side. The ape man could see him tremble, and for a moment was fearful that in his terror he would betray them. "Fear not," he whispered, "we are your friends." At last the Negro spoke in a low whisper, scarcely audible even to the keen ears of the ape man. "What," he said, "can poor Otobu do for the god who speaks to him out of the solid wall?" "This," replied Tarzan. "Two of us are coming into this room. Help us prevent this man and woman from escaping or raising an outcry that will bring others to their aid." "I will help you," replied the Negro, to keep them within this room, but do not fear that their outcries will bring others. These walls are built so that no sound may pass through, and even if it did, what difference would it make in this village which is constantly filled with screams of its mad people? Do not fear their cries. No one will notice them. I go to do your bidding." Tarzan saw the black cross the room to the table, upon which he placed another dish of food before the feasters. Then he stepped to a place behind the man, and as he did so raised his eyes to the point in the wall from which the ape-man's voice had come to him, as much to say, "Master, I am ready." Without more delay, Tarzan threw aside the hangings and stepped into the room. As he did so, the young man rose from the table, to be instantly seized from behind by the black slave. The girl, whose back was towards the ape-man and his companion, was not at first aware of their presence, but saw only the attack of the slave upon her lover, and with a loud scream she leapt forward to assist the latter. Tarzan sprang to her side and laid a heavy hand upon her arm before she could interfere with Otobu's attention to the young man. At first, as she turned toward the ape-man, her face reflected only mad rage, but almost instantly this changed to the vapid smile with which Smith Oldwick was already familiar, and her slim fingers commenced their soft appraisement of the newcomer. Almost immediately she discovered Smith Oldwick, but there was neither surprise nor anger upon her countenance. Evidently the poor mad creature knew but two principal moods, from one to the other of which she changed with lightning-like rapidity. "Watch her a moment," said Tarzan to the Englishman, "while I disarm that fellow." And stepping to the side of the young man whom Otobu was having difficulty in subduing, Tarzan relieved him of his saber. "Tell them," he said to the Negro, "if you speak their language, that we will not harm them if they leave us alone and let us depart in peace." The black had been looking at Tarzan with wide eyes, evidently not comprehending how this god could appear in so material a form, and with a voice of a white Bwana and the uniform of a warrior of this city to which he quite evidently did not belong. But nevertheless his first confidence in the voice that offered him freedom was not lessened, and he did as Tarzan bid him. "They want to know what you want," said Otobu after he had spoken to the man and the girl. "Tell them that we want food for one thing," said Tarzan, "and something else that we know where to find in this room. Take the man's spear, Otobu. I see it leaning against the wall in the corner of the room. And you, Lieutenant, take his saber." And then again to Otobu, "I will watch the man while you go and bring forth that which is beneath the couch over against the wall." And Tarzan indicated the location of the piece of furniture. Otobu, trained to obey, did as he was bid. The eyes of the man and the girl followed him, and as he drew back the hangings and dragged forth the corpse of the man Smith Oldwick had slain, the girl's lover voiced a loud scream and attempted to leap forward to the side of the corpse. Tarzan, however, seized him, and then the fellow turned upon him with teeth and nails. It was with no little difficulty that Tarzan finally subdued the man, and while Otobu was removing the outer clothing from the corpse, Tarzan asked the black to question the young man as to his evident excitement at the sight of the body. "I can tell you, Bwana," replied Otobu. "This man was his father." "What's he saying to the girl?" asked Tarzan. "He is asking her if she knew that the body of his father was under the couch, and she is saying that she did not know it." Tarzan repeated the conversation to Smith Oldwick, who smiled. If the chap could have seen her removing all the evidence of the crime and arranging the hangings of the couch so that the body was concealed after she had helped me drag it across the room, he wouldn't have very much doubt as to her knowledge of the affair. The rug you see draped over the bench in the corner was arranged to hide the blood stain. In some ways, they are not so loony after all. The black man had now removed the outer garments from the dead man, and Smith Oldwick was hastily drawing them on over his own clothing. "And now," said Tarzan, "we will sit down and eat. One accomplishes little on an empty stomach." As they ate, the ape-man attempted to carry on a conversation with the two natives through Otobu. He learned that they were in the palace, which had belonged to the dead man lying on the floor beside them. He had held an official position of some nature, and he and his family were of the ruling class, but were not members of the court. When Tarzan questioned them about Bertha Kircher, the young man said that she had been taken to the king's palace, and when asked why, replied, "For the king, of course." During the conversation, both the man and the girl appeared quite rational, even asking some questions as to the country from which their uninvited guests had come, and evidencing much surprise when informed that there was anything but waterless waste beyond their own valley. When Otobu asked the man, at Tarzan's suggestion, if he was familiar with the interior of the king's palace, he replied that he was a friend of Prince Metek, one of the king's sons, and that he often visited the palace, and that Metek also came here to his father's palace frequently. As Tarzan ate, he racked his brain for some plan whereby he might utilize the knowledge of the young man to gain entrance to the palace, but he had arrived at nothing which he considered feasible when there came a loud knocking upon the door of the outer room. For a moment no one spoke, and then the young man raised his voice and cried aloud to those without. Immediately Otobu sprang for the fellow and attempted to smother his words by clapping a palm over his mouth. "What's he saying?" asked Tarzan. "He is telling them to break down the door and rescue him and a girl from the two strangers who entered and made them prisoners. If they enter, they will kill us all." "Tell him," said Tarzan, "to hold his peace or I will slay him." Otobu did as he was instructed, and the young maniac lapsed into scowling silence. Tarzan crossed the alcove and entered the outer room to note the effect of the assaults upon the door. Smith Oldwick followed him a few steps, leaving Otobu to guard the two prisoners. The ape-man saw that the door could not long withstand the heavy blows being dealt the panels from without. "I wanted to use that fellow in the other room," he said to Smith Oldwick, "but I'm afraid we'll have to get out of here the way we came in. We can't accomplish anything by waiting here and meeting these fellows. From the noise out there must be a dozen of them. Come," he said, "you go first and I will follow." As the two turned back from the alcove, they witnessed an entirely different scene from that upon which they had turned their backs but a moment or two before. Stretched on the floor and apparently lifeless lay the body of the black slave, while the two prisoners had vanished completely. End of chapter 22. Reading by Dan Mason of Midland, Michigan. Chapter 23 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Mason. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs, Chapter 23, The Flight from Xuja. As Metek bore Bertha Kircher towards the edge of the pool, the girl at first had no conception of the deed he contemplated. But when, as they approached the edge, he did not lessen his speed, she guessed the frightful truth. As he leaped head foremost with her into the water, she closed her eyes and breathed a silent prayer, for she was confident that the maniac had no other purpose than to drown himself and her. And yet, so potent is the first law of nature, that even in the face of certain death, as she surely believed herself, she clung tenaciously to life, and while she struggled to free herself from the powerful clutches of the madman, she held her breath against the final moment when the asphyxiating waters must inevitably flood her lungs. Through the frightful ordeal, she maintained absolute control of her senses, so that, after the first plunge, she was aware that the man was swimming with her beneath the surface. He took perhaps not more than a dozen strokes directly toward the end wall of the pool, and then he arose, and once again she knew that her head was above the surface. She opened her eyes to see that they were in a corridor, dimly lighted by gratings set in a roof, a winding corridor, water-filled from wall to wall. Along this the man was swimming with easy, powerful strokes, at the same time holding her chin above the water. For 10 minutes he swam thus without stopping, and the girl heard him speak to her, though she could not understand what he said, as he evidently immediately realized, for, half floating, he shifted his hold upon her so that he could touch her nose and mouth with the fingers of one hand. She grasped what he meant and immediately took a deep breath, whereat he dove quickly beneath the surface, pulling her down with him, and again for a dozen strokes or more he swam thus wholly submerged. When they again came to the surface, Bertha Kircher saw that they were in a large lagoon, and that the bright stars were shining high above them, while on the other hand domed and minareted buildings were silhouetted sharply against the starlit sky. Metek swam swiftly to the north side of the lagoon, where, by means of a ladder, the two climbed out upon the embankment. There were others in the plaza, but they paid but little if any attention to the two bedraggled figures. As Maytek walked quickly across the pavement with the girl at his side, Bertha Kircher could only guess at the man's intentions. She could see no way in which to escape, and so went docilely with him, hoping against hope that some fortuitous circumstance might eventually arise that would give her the coveted chance for freedom and life. Maytek led her towards a building which, as she entered, she recognized as the same to which she and Lieutenant Smith Oldwick had been led when they were brought into the city. There was no man sitting behind the card desk now, but about the room were a dozen or more warriors in the tunics of the house to which they were attached, in this case white, with a small lion in the form of a crest or badge upon the breast and back of each. As Maytek entered, and the men recognized him, they arose, and in answer to a query he put, they pointed to an arched doorway at the rear of the room. Towards this Maytek led the girl, and then, as though filled with a sudden suspicion, his eyes narrowed cunningly, and turning towards the soldiery, he issued an order which resulted in their all preceding him through the small doorway and up a flight of stairs a short distance beyond. The stairway and the corridor above were lighted by small flares, which revealed several doors in the walls of the upper passageway. To one of these the men led the prince. Bertha Kircher saw them knock upon the door, and heard a voice reply faintly through the thick door to the summons. The effect upon those about her was electrical. Instantly excitement reigned, and in response to orders from the king's son, the soldiers commenced to beat heavily upon the door, to throw their bodies against it, and to attempt to hew away its panels with their sabers. The girl wondered at the cause of the evident excitement of her captors. She saw the door giving to each renewed assault, but what she did not see just before it crashed inward was the figures of two men who alone in all the world might have saved her, pass between the heavy hangings in an adjoining alcove and disappear into the dark corridor. As the door gave and the warriors rushed into the apartment followed by the prince, the latter became immediately filled with baffled rage, for the rooms were deserted except for the dead body of the owner of the palace and the still form of the black slave, Alcove, where they lay stretched upon the floor of the alcove. The prince rushed to the windows and looked out, but as the suite overlooked the barred den of lions from which the prince thought there could be no escape, his puzzlement was only increased. Though he searched about the room for some clue to the whereabouts of its former occupants, he did not discover the niche behind the hangings. With the fickleness of insanity, he quickly tired of the search, and, turning to the soldiers who had accompanied him from the floor below, dismissed them. After setting up the broken door as best they could, the men left the apartment, and when they were again alone, Maytek turned towards the girl. As he approached her, his face distorted by a hideous leer. His features worked rapidly in spasmodic twitches. The girl, who was standing at the entrance of the alcove, shrank back, her horror reflected in her face. Step by step she backed across the room, while the crouching maniac crept stealthily after her, with claw-like fingers poised in anticipation of the moment they should leap forth and seize her. As she passed the body of the Negro, her foot touched some obstacle at her side. At glancing down, she saw the spear at which Otobo had been supposed to hold the prisoners. Instantly she leaned forward and snatched it from the floor with its sharp point directed at the body of the madman. The effect upon Maytek was electrical. From stealthy silence he broke into harsh peals of laughter, and drawing his saber danced to and fro before the girl, but whichever way he went, the point of the spear still threatened him. Gradually the girl noticed a change in the tone of the creature's screams that was also reflected in the changing expression upon his hideous countenance. His hysterical laughter was slowly changing to cries of rage, while the silly leer upon his face was supplanted by a ferocious scowl and upcurled lips, which revealed the sharpened fangs beneath. He now ran rapidly in almost to the spear point, only to jump away, run a few steps to one side, and again attempt to make an entrance, the while he slashed and hewed at the spear with such violence that it was with difficulty the girl maintained her guard, and all the time was forced to give ground step by step. She had reached the point where she was standing squarely against the couch at the side of the room when, with an incredibly swift movement, Maytek stooped and, grasping a low stool, hurled it directly at her head. She raised the spear to fend off the heavy missile, but she was not entirely successful, and the impact of the blow carried her backward upon the couch, and instantly Maytek was upon her. Tarzan and Smith Oldwick gave little thought as to what had become of the other two occupants of the room. They were gone, and so far as these two were concerned, they might never return. Tarzan's one desire was to reach the street again, where, now that both of them were in some sort of disguise, they should be able to proceed with comparative safety to the palace and continue their search for the girl. Smith Oldwick preceded Tarzan along the corridor, and as they reached the ladder he climbed aloft to remove the trap. He worked for a moment, and then turning, addressed Tarzan. "Did we replace the cover on this trap when we came down? I don't recall that we did." "No," said Tarzan. "It was left open." "So I thought," said Smith Oldwick, "but it's closed now and locked. I can't move it. Possibly you can," and he descended the ladder. Even Tarzan's immense strength, however, had no effect other than to break one of the rungs of the ladder against which he was pushing, nearly precipitating him to the floor below. After the rung broke, he rested for a moment before renewing his efforts, and as he stood with his head near the cover of the trap, he distinctly heard voices on the roof above him. Dropping down to Oldwick's side, he told him what he had heard. "We had better find some other way out," he said, and the two started to retrace their steps towards the alcove. Tarzan was again in the lead, and as he opened the door in the back of the niche, he was suddenly startled to hear, in tones of terror and in a woman's voice, the words, "Oh God, be merciful," from just beyond the hangings. Here was no time for cautious investigation, and not even waiting to find the aperture and part of the hangings, but with one sweep of his brawny hand dragging them from their support, the ape-man leaped from the niche into the alcove. At the sound of his entry, the maniac looked up, and as he saw at first only a man in the uniform of his father's soldiers, he shrieked forth an angry order. But at the second glance, which revealed the face of the newcomer, the madman leapt from the prostrate form of the victim, and apparently forgetful of his saber, which he had dropped upon the floor beside the couch as he leapt to grapple with the girl, closed with bare hands upon his antagonist, his sharp-filed teeth searching for the other's throat. Metek, the son of Heyrog, was no weakling. Powerful by nature, and rendered still more so in the throes of one of his maniacal fits of fury, he was no mean antagonist, even for the mighty ape-man, and to this a distinct advantage for him was added by the fact that almost at the outset of their battle, Tarzan, in stepping backwards, struck his heel against the corpse of the man whom Smith Oldwick had killed, and fell heavily backward to the floor with Metek upon his breast. With the quickness of a cat, the maniac made an attempt to fasten his teeth in Tarzan's jugular, but a quick movement of the latter resulted in his finding a hold only upon the Tarmangani's shoulder. Here he clung while his fingers sought Tarzan's throat, and it was then that the ape-man, realizing the possibility of defeat, called to Smith Oldwick to take the girl and to seek escape. The Englishman looked questioningly at Bertha Kircher, who now had risen from the couch, shaking and trembling. She saw the question in his eyes, and with an effort she drew herself to her full height. "No," she cried. "If he dies here, I shall die with him. Go if you wish to. You can do nothing here, but I cannot go." Tarzan had now regained his feet, but the maniac still clung to him tenaciously. The girl turned suddenly to Smith Oldwick. "Your pistol!" she cried. "Why don't you shoot him?" The man drew the weapon from his pocket and approached the two antagonists, but by this time they were moving so rapidly that there was no opportunity for shooting one without the danger of hitting the other. At the same time, Bertha Kircher circled about them with the prince's saber, but neither could she find an opening. Again and again the two men fell to the floor, until presently Tarzan found a hold upon the other's throat, against which contingency Metek had been constantly battling, and slowly, as the giant fingers closed, the other's mad eyes protruded from his livid face, his jaws gaped and released their hold upon Tarzan's shoulder, and then, in a sudden excess of disgust and rage, the ape-man lifted the body of the prince high above his head, and with all the strength of his great arms hurled it across the room and through the window, where it fell with a sickening thud into the pit of lions beneath. As Tarzan turned again towards his companions, the girl was standing with the saber still in her hand, and an expression upon her face that he never had seen there before. Her eyes were wide and misty with unshed tears, while her sensitive lips trembled as though she were upon the point of giving way to some pent emotion which her rapidly rising and falling bosom plainly indicated she was fighting to control. "If we're going to get out of here," said the ape-man, We can't lose any time. We are together at last, and nothing can be gained by delay. The question now is the safest way. The couple who escaped us evidently departed through the passageway to the roof and secured the trap against us so that we are cut off in that direction. What chance have we below? You came that way." And he turned toward the girl. "At the foot of the stairs," she said, "is a room full of armed men. I doubt if we could pass that way." It was then that Otobu raised himself to a sitting posture. "So you are not dead after all," exclaimed the ape-man. "Come, how bad are you hurt?" The Negro rose gingerly to his feet, moved his arms and legs, and felt of his head. "Otobu does not seem to be hurt at all, Bwana," he replied. "Only for a great ache in his head." "Good," said the ape-man. "You want to return to Wamabu country?" "Yes, Bwana." "Then lead us from the city by the safest way." "There is no safe way," replied the black, "and even if we reach the gates we shall have to fight. I can lead you from this building to a side street with little danger of meeting anyone on the way. Beyond that we must take our chance of discovery. You are all dressed as are the people of this wicked city, so perhaps we may pass unnoticed. But at the gate it will be a different matter, for none is permitted to leave the city at night." "Very well," replied the ape-man. "Let us be on our way." Otobu led them through the broken door of the outer room, and partway down the corridor he turned to another apartment at the right. As they crossed to the passageway beyond, and finally, traversing several rooms and corridors, he led them down a flight of steps to a door which opened directly upon the side street in rear of the palace. Two men, a woman, and a black slave were not so extraordinary a sight upon the streets of the city as to arouse comment. When passing beneath the flares, the three Europeans were careful to choose a moment when no chance pedestrian might happen to get a view of their features. But in the shadow of the arcades there seemed little danger of detection. They had covered a good portion of the distance to the gate without mishap when there came to their ears from the central portion of the city sounds of a great commotion. "What does that mean?" Tarzan asked Otobu, who was now trembling violently. "Master," he replied, "they have discovered what has happened in the palace of Vesa, mayor of the city. His son and the girl escaped and summoned soldiers who have now doubtless discovered the body of Vesa." "I wonder," said Tarzan, "if they have discovered the party I threw through the window." Bertha Kircher, who understood enough of the dialect to follow their conversation, asked Tarzan if he knew that the man he had thrown from the window was the king's son. The ape-man laughed. "No," he said, "I did not. That rather complicates matters, at least if they have found him." Suddenly there broke above the turmoil behind them a clear strains of a bugle. Otobu increased his pace. "Hurry, master," he cried. "It is worse than I had thought." "What do you mean?" asked Tarzan. "For some reason the king's guard and the king's lions are being called out. I fear, O Bwana, that we cannot escape them. But why should they be called out for us, I do not know." But if Otobu did not know, Tarzan at least guessed that they had found the body of the king's son. Once again the notes of the bugle rose high and clear upon the night air. "Calling more lions?" asked Tarzan. "No, master," replied Otobu. "It is the parrots they are calling." They moved on rapidly in silence for a few minutes, when their attention was attracted by the flapping of the wings of a bird above them. They looked up to discover a parrot circling about over their heads. "Here are the parrots, Otobu," said Tarzan with a grin. "Do they expect to kill us with parrots?" The Negro moaned as the bird darted suddenly ahead of them towards the city wall. "Now indeed we are lost, master," cried the black. "The bird that found us has flown to the gate to warn the guard." "Come, Otobu, what are you talking about?" exclaimed Tarzan irritably. "Have you lived among these lunatics so long that you are yourself mad?" "No, master," replied Otobu, "I am not mad. You do not know them. These terrible birds are like human beings without hearts or souls. They speak the language of the people of the city of Xuja. They are demons, master, and when in sufficient numbers they might even attack and kill us." "How far are we from the gate?" asked Tarzan. "We are not very far," replied the Negro. "Beyond this next turn we will see it a few paces ahead of us. But the bird has reached it before us, and by now they are summoning the guard." The truth of which statement was almost immediately indicated by the sounds of many voices raised evidently in commands just ahead of them, while from behind came increased evidence of approaching pursuit, loud screams, and the roars of lions. A few steps ahead, a narrow alley opened from the east into the thoroughfare they were following, and as they approached it, there emerged from its dark shadows the figure of a mighty lion. Otobu halted in his tracks and shrank back against Tarzan. "Look, master," he whimpered, "a great black lion of the forest." Tarzan drew the saber which still hung at his side. "We cannot go back," he said. "Lions, parrots, or men, it must all be the same." And he moved steadily forward in the direction of the gate. What wind was stirring in the city street moved from Tarzan towards the lion, and when the ape-man had approached to within a few yards of the beast, who had stood silently eyeing them up to this time, instead of the expected roar, a whine broke from the beast's throat. The ape-man was conscious of a very decided feeling of relief. "It's Numa of the pit," he called back to his companions and to Otobu. "Do not fear, this lion will not harm us." Numa moved forward to the ape-man's side, and then turning, paced beside him along the narrow street. At the next turn they came in sight of the gate, where beneath several flares they saw a group of at least 20 warriors prepared to seize them, while from the opposite direction the roars of the pursuing lions sounded close upon them, mingling with the screams of numerous parrots which now circled about their heads. Tarzan halted and turned to the young aviator. "How many rounds of ammunition have you left?" he asked. "I have 7 in the pistol," responded Smith Oldwick, "and perhaps a dozen more cartridges in my blouse pocket." "I'm going to rush them," said Tarzan. "Otobu, you stay at the side of the woman. Oldwick, you and I will go ahead, you upon my left. I think we need not try to tell Numa what to do, for even then the great lion was baring his fangs and growling ferociously at the guardsmen, who appeared uneasy in the face of this creature which above all others they feared. "As we advance, Oldwick," said the ape-man, "fire one shot. It may frighten them, and after that fire only when necessary. All ready? Let's go!" And he moved forward towards the gate. At the same time Smith Oldwick discharged his weapon, and a yellow-coated warrior screamed and crumpled forward upon his face. For a minute the others showed symptoms of panic, but one, who seemed to be an officer, rallied them. "Now," said Tarzan, "all together!" And he started to run for the gate. Simultaneously the lion, evidently scenting the purpose of the Tarmangani, broke into a full charge toward the guard. Shaken by the report of the unfamiliar weapon, the ranks of the guardsmen broke before the furious assault of the great beast. The officer screamed forth a volley of commands in a mad fury of uncontrolled rage, but the guardsmen, obeying the first law of nature, as well as actuated by their inherent fear of the black denizen of the forest, scattered to the right and left to elude the monster. With ferocious growls, Numa wheeled to the right and with raking talons struck right and left among the little handful of terrified guardsmen who were endeavoring to elude him, and then Tarzan and Smith Oldwick closed with the others. For a moment their most formidable antagonist was the officer in command. He wielded his curved saber as only an adept might, as he faced Tarzan, to whom the similar weapon in his own hand was most unfamiliar. Smith Oldwick could not fire for fear of hitting the ape-man, when suddenly to his dismay he saw Tarzan's weapon fly from his grasp as the Xujan warrior neatly disarmed his opponent. With a scream the fellow raised his saber for the final cut that would terminate the earthly career of Tarzan of the Apes when, to the astonishment of both the ape-man and Smith Oldwick, the fellow stiffened rigidly, his weapon dropped from his nerveless fingers of his upraised hand, his mad eyes rolled upward and foam flecked his bared lip. Grasping as though in the throes of strangulation, the fellow pitched forward at Tarzan's feet. Tarzan stooped and picked up the dead man's weapon, a smile upon his face as he turned and glanced toward the young Englishman. "The fellow is an epileptic," said Smith Oldwick. "I suppose many of them are. Their nervous condition is not without its good points. A normal man would have gotten you." The other guardsmen seemed utterly demoralized at the loss of their leader. They were huddled upon the opposite side of the street at the left of the gate, screaming at the top of their voices and looking in the direction from which sounds of reinforcements were coming, as though urging on the men and lions that were already too close for comfort of the fugitives. 6 guardsmen still stood with their backs against the gate, their weapons flashing in the light of the flares, and their parchment-like faces distorted in horrid grimaces of rage and terror. Numa had pursued 2 fleeing warriors down the street which paralleled the wall for a short distance at this point. The ape-man turned to Smith Oldwick. "You will have to use your pistol now," he said, "and we must get by these fellows at once." And as the Englishman fired, Tarzan rushed in to close quarters as though he had not already discovered that with the saber he was no match for these trained swordsmen. 2 men fell to Smith Oldwick's first 2 shots, and then he missed, while the 4 remaining divided, 2 leaping for the aviator and 2 for Tarzan. The ape-man rushed in an effort to close with one of his antagonists, where the other's saber would be comparatively useless. Smith Oldwick dropped one of his assailants with a bullet through the chest and pulled his trigger on the second, only to have the hammer fall futilely upon an empty chamber. The cartridges in his weapon were exhausted, and the warrior, with his razor-edged gleaming saber, was upon him. Tarzan raised his own weapon but once, and that to divert a vicious cut for his head. Then he was upon one of his assailants, and before the fellow could regain his equilibrium and leap back after delivering his cut, the ape-man had seized him by the neck and crotch. Tarzan's other antagonist was edging around to one side where he might use his weapon, and as he raised the blade to strike at the back of the Tarmangani's neck, the latter swung the body of his comrade upward so that it received the full force of the blow. The blade sank deep into the body of the warrior, eliciting a single frightful scream, and then Tarzan hurled the dying man in the face of his final adversary. Smith Oldwick, hard pressed and now utterly defenseless, had given up all hope in the instant that he realized his weapon was empty, when, from his left, a living bolt of black-maned ferocity shot past him to the breast of his opponent. Down went the Xujan, his face bitten away by one snap of the powerful jaws of Numa of the pit. In the few seconds that had been required for the consummation of these rapidly ensuing events, Otobu had dragged Bertha Kircher to the gate which he had unbarred and thrown open, and with the vanquishing of the last of the active guardsmen, the party passed out of the maniac city of Xuja into the outer darkness beyond. At the same moment, a half-dozen lions rounded the last turn in the road leading back towards the plaza, and at sight of them Numa the pit wheeled and charged. For a moment the lions of the city stood their ground, but only for a moment, and then before the black beast was upon them they turned and fled, while Tarzan and his party moved rapidly toward the blackness of the forest beyond the garden. "Will they follow us out of the city?" Tarzan asked Otobu. "Not at night," replied the black. "I have been a slave here for 5 years, but never have I known these people to leave the city by night. If they go beyond the forest in the daytime, they usually wait until the dawn of another day before they return, as they fear to pass through the country of the black lions after dark. No, I think, master, that they will not follow us tonight, but tomorrow they will come, and, O Bwana, then they will surely get us, or those who are left of us, for at least one among us must be the toll of the black lions as we pass through their forest." As they crossed the garden, Smith Oldwick refilled the magazine of his pistol and inserted a cartridge in the chamber. The girl moved silently at Tarzan's left, between him and the aviator. Suddenly the ape-man stopped and turned toward the city, his mighty frame clothed in the yellow tunic of Herig's soldiery, plainly visible to the others beneath the light of the stars. They saw him raise his head, and they heard break from his lips the plaintive note of a lion calling to his fellows. Smith Oldwick felt a distinct shudder pass through his frame, while Otobu, rolling the whites of his eyes in terrified surprise, sank trembling to his knees. But the girl thrilled, and she felt her heart beat in strange exultation, and then she drew nearer to the beast-man until her shoulder touched his arm. The act was involuntary, and for a moment she scarce realized what she had done, and then she stepped silently back, thankful that the light of the stars was not sufficient to reveal to the eyes of her companions the flush which she felt mantling her cheek. Yet she was not ashamed of the impulse that had prompted her, but rather the act itself, which she knew, had Tarzan noticed it, would have been repulsive to him. From the open gate of the city of Maniacs came the answering cry of a lion. The little group waited where they stood until presently they saw the majestic portions of the black lion as he approached them along the trail. When he had rejoined them, Tarzan fastened the fingers of one hand in the black mane and started on once more toward the forest. Behind them, from the city, rose a bedlam of horrid sounds, the roaring of lions mingling with the raucous voices of the screaming parrots and the mad shrieks of the maniacs. As they entered the Stygian darkness of the forest, the girl once again involuntarily shrank closer to the ape-man, and this time Tarzan was aware of the contact. himself without fear, yet he instinctively appreciated how terrified the girl must be. Actuated by a sudden kindly impulse, he found her hand and took it in his own, and thus they continued upon their way, groping through the blackness of the trail. Twice they were approached by forest lions, but upon both occasions the deep growls of Numa of the Pit drove off their assailants. Several times they were compelled to rest, for Smith Oldwick was constantly upon the verge of exhaustion, and towards morning Tarzan was forced to carry him on the steep ascent from the bed of the valley. End of chapter 23. Recording by Dan Mason of Midland, Michigan. Chapter 24 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Mason. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 24. The Tommies. Daylight overtook them after they had entered the gorge, but, tired as they all were, with the exception of Tarzan, they realized that they must keep on at all costs until they found a spot where they might ascend the precipitous side of the gorge to the floor of the plateau above. Tarzan and Otobu were both equally confident that the Xujas would not follow them beyond the gorge, but though they scanned every inch of the frowning cliffs, upon either hand noon came and there was still no indication of any avenue of escape to right or left. There were places where the ape-man alone might have negotiated the ascent, but none where the others could hope successfully to reach the plateau, nor where Tarzan, powerful and agile as he was, could have ventured safely to carry them aloft. For half a day the ape-man had been either carrying or supporting Smith Oldwick, and now, to his chagrin, he saw that the girl was faltering. He had realized well how much she had undergone, and how greatly the hardships and dangers and the fatigue of the past weeks must have told upon her vitality. He saw how bravely she attempted to keep up, yet how often she stumbled and staggered as she labored through the sand and gravel of the gorge. Nor could he help but admire her fortitude and the uncomplaining effort she was making to push on. The Englishman must have noticed her condition too, for some time after noon he stopped suddenly and sat down in the sand. "It's no use," he said to Tarzan. "I can go no farther. Miss Kircher was rapidly weakening. You will have to go on without me." "No," said the girl. "We cannot do that. We have all been through so much together, and the chances of our escape are still so remote that whatever comes, let us remain together unless," and she looked up at Tarzan, "you, who have done so much for us, to whom you are under no obligations, will go on without us. I, for one, wish you would. It must be as evident to you as it is to me that you cannot save us, for though you succeed in dragging us from the path of our pursuers, even your great strength and endurance could never take one of us across the desert waste which lies between here and the nearest fertile country." The ape-man returned her serious look with a smile. "You are not dead," he said to her, "nor is the lieutenant, nor Otobu, nor myself. One is either dead or alive, and until we are dead we should plan only upon continuing to live. Because we remain here and rest is no indication that we shall die here. I cannot carry you both on the country of the Mabus, which is the nearest spot at which we may expect to find game and water, but we shall not give up on that account. So far we have found a way. Let us take things as they come. Let us rest now, because you and Lieutenant Smith Oldwick need the rest, and when you are stronger we will go on again." "But the Xujas?" she asked. "May they not follow us here?" "Yes," he said, "they probably will, but we need not be concerned with them until they come." "I wish," said the girl, "that I possessed your philosophy, but I am afraid it's beyond me." "You were not born and reared in the jungle by wild beasts and among wild beasts, or you would possess, as I do, the fatalism of the jungle." And so they moved to the side of the gorge beneath the shade of an overhanging rock and lay down in the hot sand to rest. Numa wandered restlessly to and fro, and finally, after sprawling for a moment close beside the ape-man, rose and moved off up the gorge to be lost to view a moment later beyond the nearest turn. For an hour the little party rested, and then Tarzan suddenly rose and, motioning the others to silence, listened. For a minute he stood motionless, his keen ears acutely receptive to the sounds so faint and distant that none of the other three could detect the slightest break in the utter and deathlike quiet of the gorge. Finally, the ape-man relaxed and turned toward them. "What is it?" asked the girl. "They are coming," he replied. "They are yet some distance away, though not far, for the sandaled feet of the men and the pads of the lions make little noise upon the soft sands." "What shall we do? Try to go on?" asked Smith Oldwick. "I believe I could make a go of it now for a short way. I am much rested. How about you, Miss Kircher?" "Oh, yes," she said. "I am much stronger. Yes, surely I can go on." Tarzan knew that neither of them quite spoke the truth, that people do not recover so quickly from utter exhaustion, but he saw no other way, and there was always the hope that just beyond the next turn would be a way out of the gorge. "You help the lieutenant, Otobu," he said, turning to the black, "and I will carry Miss Kircher." And though the girl objected, saying that he must not waste his strength, he lifted her lightly in his arms and moved off up the canyon, followed by Otobu and the Englishman. They had gone no great distance when the others of the party became aware of the sounds of pursuit, for now the lions were whining as though the fresh scent spoor of their quarry had reached their nostrils. "I wish that your Numa would return," said the girl. "Yes," said Tarzan, "but we shall have to do the best we can without him. I should like to find some place where we can barricade ourselves against attack from all sides. Possibly then we might hold them off. Smith Oldwick is a good shot, and if there are not too many men he might be able to dispose of them, provided they can only come at him one at a time. The lions don't bother me so much. Sometimes they're stupid animals, and I'm sure that these that pursue us, and who are so dependent upon the masters that have raised and trained them, will be easily handled after the warriors are disposed of." "You think there is some hope then?" she asked. "We are still alive," was his only answer. "There," he said presently, "I thought I recalled this very spot." He pointed towards a fragment that had evidently fallen from the summit off the cliff, and which now lay embedded in the sand a few feet from the base. It was a jagged fragment of rock which rose some 10 feet above the surface of the sand, leaving a narrow aperture between it and the cliff behind. Towards this they directed their steps, and when finally they reached their goal, they found a space about 2 feet wide and 10 feet long between the rock and the cliff. To be sure, it was open at both ends, but at least they could not be attacked upon all sides at once. They had scarcely concealed themselves before Tarzan's quick ears caught a sound upon the face of the cliff above them, and looking up he saw a diminutive monkey perched upon a slight projection, an ugly-faced little monkey who looked down upon them for a moment and then scampered away toward the south in the direction from which their pursuers were coming. Otobu had seen the monkey too. "He will tell the parrots," said the black, "and the parrots will tell the madmen." "It is all the same," replied Tarzan. "The lions would have found us here. We could not hope to hide from them." He placed Smith Oldwick with his pistol at the north opening of their haven, and told Otobu to stand with his spear at the Englishman's shoulder, while he himself prepared to guard the southern approach. Between them he had the girl lie down in the sand. "You will be safe there in the event that they use their spears," he said. The minutes that dragged by seemed veritable eternities to Bertha Kircher, and then at last, and almost with relief, she knew that the pursuers were upon them. She heard the angry roaring of the lions and the cries of the madmen. For several minutes the men seemed to be investigating the stronghold which their quarry had discovered. She could hear them both to the north and south, and then from where she lay she saw a lion charging for the ape-man before her. She saw the giant arm swing back with the curved saber, and she saw it fall with terrific velocity and meet the lion as he rose to grapple with the man, cleaving his skull as cleanly as a butcher opens a sheep. Then she heard footsteps running rapidly toward Smith Oldwick, and as his pistol spoke there was a scream and the sound of a falling body. Evidently disheartened by the failure of their first attempt, the assaulters drew off, but only for a short time. Again they came, this time a man opposing Tarzan and a lion seeking to overcome Smith Oldwick. Tarzan had cautioned the young Englishman not to waste his cartridges upon the lions, and it was Otobu with the Xujan spear who met the beast, which was not subdued until both he and Smith Oldwick had been mauled, and the latter had succeeded in running the point of the saber the girl had carried into the beast's heart. The man who opposed Tarzan inadvertently came too close in an attempt to cut at the ape-man's head, with the result that an instant later his corpse lay with the neck broken upon the body of the lion. Once again the enemy withdrew, but again only for a short time. And now they came in full force, the lions and the men, possibly a half a dozen of each, the men casting their spears and the lions waiting just behind, evidently for the signal to charge. "Is this the end?" asked the girl. "No," cried the ape-man, "for we are still alive." The words had scarcely passed his lips when the remaining warriors, rushing in, cast their spears simultaneously from both sides. In attempting to shield the girl, Tarzan received one of the shafts in the shoulder, and so heavily had the weapon been hurled that it bore him backward to the ground. Smith Oldwick fired his pistol twice when he too was struck down, the weapon entering his right leg midway between hip and knee. Only Otobu remained to face the enemy, for the Englishman, already weak from his wounds and from the latest mauling he had received at the claws of the lion, had lost consciousness as he sank to the ground with his new hurt. As he fell, his pistol dropped from his fingers, and the girl, seeing, snatched it up. As Tarzan struggled to rise, one of the warriors leapt full upon his breast and bore him back as with fiendish shrieks he raised the point of his saber above the other's heart. Before he could drive it home, the girl leveled Smith Oldwick's pistol and fired point blank at the fiend's face. Simultaneously, there broke upon the astonished ears of both attackers and attacked a volley of shots from the gorge. With the sweetness of the voice of an angel from heaven, the Europeans heard the sharp-barked commands of an English non-com. Even above the roars of the lions and the screams of the maniacs, those beloved tones reached the ears of Tarzan and the girl at the very moment that even the ape-man had given up the last vestige of hope. Rolling the body of the warrior to one side, Tarzan struggled to his feet, the spear still protruding from his shoulder. The girl rose too, and as Tarzan wrenched the weapon from his flesh and stepped out from behind the concealment of the refuge, she followed at his side. The skirmish that has resulted in their rescue was soon over. Most of the lions escaped, but all of the pursuing Xuans had been slain. As Tarzan and the girl came into full view of the group, the British Tommy leveled his rifle at the ape-man. Seeing the fellow's actions and realizing instantly the natural error that Tarzan's yellow tunic had occasioned, the girl sprang between him and the soldier. "Don't shoot," she cried to the latter. "We are both friends." "Hold up your hands, you, then," he commanded Tarzan. "I ain't taking no chances with any duffer with a yellow shirt." At this juncture, the British sergeant who had been in command of the advance guard approached, and when Tarzan and the girl spoke to him in English, explaining their disguises, he accepted their word, since they were evidently not of the same race as the creatures which lay dead about them. 10 minutes later, the main body of the expedition came into view. Smith Oldwick's wounds were dressed, as well as were those of the ape-man, and in half an hour they were on their way to the camp of their rescuers. That night it was arranged that the following day Smith Oldwick and Bertha Kircher should be transported to British headquarters near the coast by aeroplane, the 2 planes attached to the expeditionary force being requisitioned for the purpose. Tarzan and Otobu declined the offers of the British captain to accompany his force overland on the return march, as Tarzan explained that his country lay to the west, as did Otobu's, and that they would travel together as far as the country of the Wamabos. "You are not going back with us then?" asked the girl. "No," replied the ape-man. "My home is to the west coast. I will continue my journey in that direction." She cast appealing eyes towards him. "You will go back into that terrible jungle?" she asked. "We shall never see you again?" He looked at her a moment in silence. "Never," he said, and without another word turned and walked away. In the morning, Colonel Capel came from the base camp in one of the planes that was to carry Smith Oldwick and the girl to the east. Tarzan was standing some distance away as the ship landed and the officer descended to the ground. He saw the colonel greet his junior in command of the advanced detachment, and then he saw him turn toward Bertha Kircher, who was standing a few paces behind the captain. Tarzan wondered how the German spy felt in this situation, especially when she must know that there was one there who knew her real status. He saw Colonel Capel walk towards her with outstretched hands and smiling face, and although he could not hear the words of his greeting, he saw that it was friendly and cordial to a degree. Tarzan turned away scowling. and if any had been close by they might have heard a low growl rumble from his chest. He knew that his country was at war with Germany, and that not only his duty to the land of his fathers, but also his personal grievance against the enemy people and his hatred of them demanded that he expose the girl's perfidy. And yet he hesitated, and because he hesitated, he growled, not at the German spy, but at himself for his weakness. He did not see her again before she entered a plane and was bore away toward the east. He bid farewell to Smith Oldwick and received again the oft-repeated thanks of the young Englishman. And then he saw him too, bore aloft in the high circling plane, and watched until the ship became a speck far above the eastern horizon to disappear at last high in the air. The Tommies, their packs and accoutrements slung, were waiting the summons to continue their return march. Colonel Capell had, through the desire to personally observe the stretch of country between the camp of the advanced detachment and the base, decided to march back his troops. Now that all was in readiness for departure, he turned to Tarzan. "I wish you would come back with us, Greystoke," he said, "and if my appeal carries no inducement, possibly that of Smith Oldwick and the young lady who just left us may. They ask me to urge you to return to civilization." "No," said Tarzan, "I shall go my own way." Miss Kircher and the Lieutenant Smith Oldwick were only prompted by a sense of gratitude in considering my welfare. "Miss Kircher!" exclaimed Campbell, and then he laughed. "You know her then as Bertha Kircher, the German spy?" Tarzan looked at the other a moment in silence. It was beyond him to conceive that a British officer should thus laconically speak of an enemy spy whom he had had within his power and permitted to escape. "Yes," he replied, "I knew that she was Bertha Kircher, the German spy." "Is that all you knew?" asked Capell. "That is all," said the ape-man. "She is the Honorable Patricia Campbell," said Campbell, "one of the most valuable members of the British intelligence service attached to the East African forces. Her father and I served in India together, and I have known her ever since she was born." "Why, here's a packet of papers she took from a German officer and has been carrying around through all her vicissitudes, single-minded in the performance of her duty. Look, I haven't had time to examine them, but as you see here is a military sketch map, a bundle of reports, and the diary of one Hauptmann Fritz Snyder." "The diary of Hauptmann Fritz Snyder?" repeated Tarzan in a constrained voice. "May I see it, Capell? He is the man who murdered Lady Greystoke." The Englishman handed the little volume over to the other without a word. Tarzan ran through the pages quickly, looking for a certain date, the date of the horror that had been committed, and when he found it he read rapidly. Suddenly a gasp of incredulity burst from his lips. Capell looked at him questioningly. "God!" exclaimed the ape-man. "Can this be true? Listen!" And he read an excerpt from the closely written page. "Played a little joke on the English pig. When he comes home he will find the burned body of his wife in her boudoir, but he will only think it is his wife. Had Von Goss substituted the body of a dead negress and char it after putting Lady Greystoke's rings on it, Lady G will be of more value to the High Command alive than dead." "She lives!" cried Tarzan. "Thank God!" exclaimed Campbell. "And now?" "I will return with you, of course. How terribly I have wronged Miss Canby, but how could I know? I even told Smith Oldwick, who loves her, that she was a German spy. Not only must I return to find my wife, but I must right this wrong." "Don't worry about that," said Capell. "She must have convinced him that she's no enemy spy, for just before they left this morning he told me she had promised to marry him." End of chapter 24. Recording by Dan Mason of